The cold bite of November air settled in as the fire crackled low. I had been nursing a bottle of rum, and I could feel its warmth spreading through my body, dulling the chill and making the flickering flames dance in my vision. My buddy, Daniel, sat across from me, idly poking the embers with a stick. We had spent the day hiking through his family's property, several hundred acres of untouched woods in southern Georgia. It was one of those places where you could go a whole day without hearing anything man-made, just the rustle of wind through trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. Our campsite was simple. We had strung up hammocks between the trees and thrown tarps over them in case the weather turned. My rucksack sat by my chair, an unopened MRE next to it, but I was too far gone to even think about preparing it. My fingers fumbled when I tried, so I gave up and leaned back, letting the fire warm my face while I drifted in and out of that drunken haze. Not quite asleep, but not fully awake either. The woods were quiet except for the occasional crackle of burning wood. The temperature had dropped enough that the dampness in the air settled into my clothes, but I barely noticed. I was comfortable, lost in the kind of drunkenness that made my limbs heavy and my mind slow. I could hear Daniel shifting in his chair, probably keeping an eye on the fire, making sure it wouldn't burn out before we turned in for the night. Then, without warning, the stillness shattered. Something was moving through the trees, fast. Not the slow, deliberate crunch of a deer picking its way through the underbrush or the hesitant scurry of a raccoon. This was different, heavy.
Urgent.
I blinked, trying to sit up, but my limbs felt sluggish. Daniel was already on his feet, rifle in hand, his headlamp cutting through the dark as he swung the beam toward the noise. I turned just in time to see a blur of motion, low to the ground, barreling toward us. An 80-pound pitbull. The dog was charging straight for the fire, muscles tight, eyes locked on us. Its breath came in heavy, snorting bursts, and even in my drunken state, I could see the gleam of its teeth in the firelight. Daniel's voice cut through the night, tight with panic. Do I shoot it? But before he could make a decision, my body moved on its own. My blood roared in my ears, and suddenly I was on my feet, running straight at the dog. Arms above my head, I screamed. A deep, guttural sound I didn't even know I could make. It wasn't words, just pure, raw noise, something primal that erupted from the depths of my chest. The dog skidded to a halt, ears pinned back, confusion flashing in its wild eyes. I kept going, legs pumping, my body fueled by some instinct I didn't understand. The dog hesitated for half a second, then turned tail and bolted back into the woods, crashing through the brush as fast as it had come. I stopped, breath ragged, heart hammering so hard I thought it would explode out of my chest. The firelight flickered behind me, stretching my shadow long against the trees. My whole body trembled, the rush of adrenaline crashing into the lingering fog of alcohol. I turned back to Daniel, who was still standing frozen, rifle half raised, eyes wide. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The forest around us was still again, the echoes of my screams swallowed by the trees. The dog was gone. The weight of what had just happened started settling in, thick and heavy. That dog had been out here alone. No collar, no sign of an owner. We were deep in the woods, miles from any property line or road. What the hell had it been doing out here? Why had it charged us? And more importantly, had it been alone? I turned slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The trees pressed in, their branches swaying in the cold night air. The pit bull could be anywhere now, watching, waiting. Or maybe it was long gone, spooked by whatever madness had possessed me to charge at it like some kind of lunatic. Daniel finally lowered his rifle, exhaling sharply. Jesus Christ, he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the ground. I stood there for a while, trying to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I wasn't drunk anymore, not really. The buzz had been drowned by the rush of adrenaline, leaving behind nothing but cold and exhaustion. I took a step back toward the fire, feeling the way my legs wobbled underneath me. I needed to sit down, to process what had just happened, but the thought of closing my eyes out here suddenly felt impossible. We never heard the dog again that night, but neither of us slept much. Every snapping twig sent my nerves on edge. Every rustling leaf made me grip my knife tighter. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we were both still awake, our nerves raw. We packed up in silence, every movement feeling slow, deliberate. The night before had left something heavy in the air, an unspoken agreement that we weren't going to talk about it, at least not right away. As we hiked back toward the truck, the woods felt different, less familiar, more threatening. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a pair of yellow eyes staring back at me from the tree line. When we finally made it back to the truck, I hesitated before climbing in. I turned to look back at the woods one last time, half expecting to see something moving in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the trees and the silence and the lingering echo of something that shouldn't have happened. I still go camping, still love the woods, but I don't drink like that anymore when I do. Lesson learned. The sun hung heavy in the sky, a relentless mass of white-hot fire that stretched shadows long and twisted across the dirt. The air itself was thick, pressing down on my skin, turning each breath into something sluggish, something forced. My shirt clung to my back, the sweat rolling down in beads that soaked into the waistband of my shorts. We had been here for 2 days, camped out in this arid wasteland that promised beauty and adventure, but delivered only exhaustion. It wasn't supposed to be this hot, not in early summer. The forecast had lied, or maybe I had just convinced myself that the desert would be kind to us. It wasn't. The campground was a simple one, carved into the rocky landscape like an afterthought. A handful of picnic tables, a couple of fire pits, and an outhouse that smelled like something long dead. Other campers were scattered around, but not many. People who knew better had probably stayed away, waiting for the cooler months. We were here for our daughter, 3 years old, wide-eyed with wonder, fearless in the way only small children could be. She loved camping, loved the idea of sleeping outside, loved the way the world felt bigger out here. She ran barefoot across the dirt, unbothered by the heat that radiated up from the ground, her tiny feet kicking up clouds of dust. My husband and I worked in silence, setting up for lunch. The food sat on the table, forgotten for a moment, as we turned our attention to something trivial, the cooler, the tent, the angle of the shade. It was a moment, one brief, fleeting moment. That was all it took. She was gone. I turned, expecting to see her beside me, but the space where she had been just seconds before was empty. My heart lurched, a dull thud in my chest that sent ice through my veins. "No," I whispered, scanning the immediate area. She had to be here. There was nowhere to go, nowhere she could have disappeared to in the span of a breath. Panic rose like bile in my throat. I called her name once, twice, the sound sharp and unfamiliar in my own ears. No answer. My voice grew louder, edged with hysteria. My husband's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto mine. He saw the fear before I could even say the words. We ran. Through the camp, past the picnic table, past the tent, past the van. The heat was unbearable now, suffocating, but I didn't care. I screamed her name, over and over, the sound tearing from my throat, raw and desperate. I ran to the dirt road that led away from the campground, my feet barely touching the ground. She wasn't there. I turned, sprinting in the opposite direction, scanning the dry brush, the rocks, the endless horizon. Nothing. My husband was running too, his voice hoarse as he called out. We checked behind every tree, every boulder, every possible hiding place. Other campers noticed, their conversations faltering as they looked our way. A few stood, hesitant, as if unsure whether to intervene. My head was spinning. My hands shook. I ran back to the van, yanked the door open, looked inside. It was empty. Nothing but blankets, bags, and the dull stench of hot fabric. My heart pounded as I slammed the door shut and kept moving. I ran, I searched, I screamed. I don't know how long it lasted. Time lost all meaning. My body moved on instinct, fueled only by the raw, primal terror that clawed at my insides. And then, just as suddenly as she had vanished, my husband found her. In the van. The same van I had checked. The same van I had shut. I turned at his voice, my stomach twisting as I saw him pull her from inside, her small body limp against his chest. The heat. The van had been baking in the sun, turning into an oven in the time we had spent searching. I staggered toward them, my legs weak, my breaths coming in short, gasping bursts. She was awake, dazed, blinking against the harsh light. My husband held her tight, his entire body trembling. She had been hiding, playing a game. She had learned how to open and close the sliding van door, something I had taught her months ago, never once considering the consequences. She had hidden under a pile of clothes, waiting, silent, as I searched. As I opened the door, called her name, looked inside, and when I shut the door, locking the heat inside with her, she had stayed there, waiting. I collapsed onto the ground, my chest heaving, my body racked with something between relief and nausea. She was okay. She was alive. But in another version of this story, she wasn't. In another universe, we didn't find her in time. The thought hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind from my lungs. I couldn't stop shaking. The weight of what had almost happened pressed down on me, suffocating. I wanted to cry, to scream, to undo everything that had led to this moment. We left that night, packed up everything, threw it into the van without a second thought. The campground blurred past as we drove, the desert stretching out around us, endless and unforgiving. We didn't go home. We couldn't. Instead, we found a cabin cool, safe, enclosed. No more tents, no more open spaces, no more hidden places where a child could slip away. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it happening again. The empty space where she had been, the silence, the heat. I don't know if I will ever stop seeing it, if the fear will ever fully leave me. Maybe it's still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting, like the desert, like the heat, like the van, with its door closed, locked tight against the world, waiting. We set up camp deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road, the kind of place where you don't just stumble across another group of people. It was early September, still warm in the day but with a biting chill at night. 6 of us had made the trip, packed into 2 cars, driving down winding dirt roads until we found a perfect spot. A small clearing near a slow-moving river, surrounded by towering pines and thick brush. After setting up our tents, 2 per tent, we spent the day exploring. The woods were alive. Birds chattered in the trees, squirrels darted through the underbrush, and we even spotted a black bear in the distance, rummaging through fallen logs. It wasn't close enough to be a problem, but we kept a mental note of it. Coyotes yipped in the distance as the sun dipped lower, a reminder that we weren't alone out here. A few miles away, someone mentioned a moose had been spotted just days before. As the sun set, we lit a fire, cooked dinner, and passed around a bottle of whiskey. We talked and laughed, the kind of easy conversation that comes when you're far from phone screens and schedules. The fire crackled, and the night settled in around us. One by one, we peeled off to bed, zipping up our tents, cocooning ourselves in our sleeping bags. The forest continued its nightly symphony outside, distant howls, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a branch under some unseen animal's foot. At some point in the night, I woke up. I don't know why. No noise had startled me. No nightmare yanked me from sleep. My eyes just opened to the pitch darkness of the tent, my ears straining in the silence. And it was silent, dead silent. No wind through the trees, no insects buzzing, no owls hooting or branches creaking. The kind of quiet that feels unnatural in the wild. I lay there, my heartbeat picking up, trying to convince myself it was normal. Maybe the animals had settled in for the night, maybe the wind had simply died down. But the silence pressed against my ears, thick and heavy, and the more I noticed it, the more it felt wrong. I forced myself to close my eyes, turning onto my side, trying to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I needed to sleep, and then it happened. Something slammed into the back of the tent. Hard, fast. The impact hit me directly in the back, shoving me forward onto my stomach. It wasn't a gentle bump or a nudge from a curious animal. It was a violent, deliberate force. My breath caught in my throat, my body frozen in sheer panic. For a long moment, I didn't move, couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. An animal? But what animal moves without sound? What animal hits a tent that hard and then nothing? Because that was the most terrifying part. After the impact, there was nothing. No sound of movement, no retreating footsteps, no rustling in the leaves, just silence, as if whatever had hit the tent had vanished into thin air. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would wake my friend sleeping beside me. I pressed my lips together to keep from making a sound, every instinct screaming at me to stay still, to stay quiet. I lay there for what felt like hours, my muscles locked, my mind flipping through every possibility. A bear? No, a bear wouldn't hit the tent like that and then leave without making a sound. Person? That thought sent a different kind of terror through me. But who? We were miles from anyone with no other campsites nearby. And if it had been a person, wouldn't they have made some kind of noise, breathing, footsteps, anything? But there was nothing. Eventually, exhaustion overpowered fear. My body, still tense, surrendered to sleep in short, restless bursts. Each time I woke, the forest was still silent. It stayed that way until the faintest light seeped through the fabric of the tent. I was the first one up. My head pounded from lack of sleep, my body stiff. I climbed out of the tent, stretching, trying to shake the unease that still clung to me. The air was cool, the forest waking up around me. Birds singing, leaves rustling, the normal sounds of morning. I walked around to the back of the tent, my stomach tight. Nothing, no footprints, no marks on the ground, no sign that anything had been there at all. I crouched down, running my hand over the dirt, searching for some clue, but the ground was undisturbed. It was as if nothing had happened. When the others woke up, I told them what had happened. No one else had heard anything. No one else had felt anything. It was just me. They tossed out theories, a falling branch, a bird flying into the tent, maybe even a dream. But I knew what I had felt, the force of that impact, the way it had shoved me forward, the way the silence had swallowed the night before and after it happened. I never found an explanation. We stayed another night. Nothing happened. The forest was alive again, the normal sounds filling the darkness. But I barely slept, my ears straining for any shift in the noise, any unnatural silence, any sign that whatever had been out there might return. We left the next morning, packing up camp and hiking back to the cars. As we drove away, leaving the dense forest behind, I found myself looking out the window, scanning the trees, searching for something, anything that could have caused it. I never saw anything, but I never forgot it, and I still don't know what hit my tent that night. I had always considered myself an outdoorsman. Growing up in Kansas, camping trips were a regular part of my life. There was something about being out in the wilderness, away from the noise and lights of the city, that felt like a return to something primal. So when my wife and I planned a trip with 3 of my closest friends to a remote waterhole in eastern Colorado, I was more excited than cautious. The place was just a blip on the map, a little canyon in the middle of the plains, hidden away from any major roads. A local had told one of my friends about it, said it was a great spot for camping and cliff jumping. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find in a travel guide. If you didn't know exactly where you were going, you'd miss it. We arrived in the late afternoon, bumping down a dirt path in an old SUV until we found a spot flat enough to set up camp. The canyon itself was beautiful, red rock walls maybe 30 feet high, and at the base, a clear water hole surrounded by scattered trees and thick bushes. It was the kind of spot that looked untouched, like we were the first people to ever camp there. We set up our tents in a half circle around the fire pit and got to work gathering wood. The place felt isolated, which was exactly what we wanted. No cell service, no other people. Just us, the open sky, and the distant sound of wind rushing through the canyon walls. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we settled around the fire, cooking over an open flame and telling stories. It was the kind of night that felt timeless. The air cool but comfortable, the stars burning bright overhead. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of small animals in the brush. Then we heard the footsteps. It was subtle at first, just a soft crunching in the leaves off to our left. We all paused, listening. I told myself it was just a raccoon or some other small creature, but the sound was heavy, too heavy. My buddy gave me a look, like he was thinking the same thing. Then came the grunting. It was low, guttural, carrying through the night air. Not human, but not entirely animal either. My pulse quickened. Someone grabbed the axe we had used earlier to chop wood. Another friend picked up a knife. We weren't really afraid, at least that's what we told ourselves. But there was something unsettling about the way the sound carried, the way it seemed to circle us. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, scanning the brush. The sound stopped. We waited, frozen, staring out into the trees. After a long moment, whatever it was seemed to move away. The grunting faded, and eventually, the night was quiet again. We laughed it off, joking about how we were a bunch of grown men huddling together with weapons over a raccoon or a deer. But no one put their weapons back in the pile we had set by the tree. Instead, each of us kept them within reach as we settled back down by the fire. 15 minutes later, the peace was shattered. A shriek, high and piercing, cut through the night. It was close, too close. Then, chaos erupted from the brush. The sounds of pigs squealing, coyotes yipping and growling, the unmistakable noise of animals fighting for their lives. It was violent and raw, a full-on battle just 50 feet from where we sat. Every single one of us jumped to our feet, weapons in hand, flashlights swinging wildly to find the source. But we saw nothing, just shifting shadows and the movement of bushes shaking violently. The fight went on for what felt like minutes, the noises blending into something unrecognizable. Snarls, grunts, screams. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. Not even the chirping of crickets. It felt wrong, like something had interrupted the natural order of things. After a long, tense moment, we lowered our weapons. No one said anything, but we all did the same thing without thinking. We sat back down by the fire, this time keeping our weapons close. We should have left then, but we didn't. Curiosity won over common sense. After a while, we decided to check out where the fight had happened. We moved cautiously, flashlights bobbing as we stepped over rocks and dry brush. The ground was disturbed, but there were no bodies, no blood. Nothing to explain the violent sounds we had just heard. Just a lone bush, shaking slightly in the still night air. As we got closer, it let out a sound. A low, wounded growl, like a dog in pain. Every hair on my body stood on end. None of us moved, and then, slowly, the shaking stopped. The bush went still. We didn't check any further. We turned and walked quickly back to the fire. The rest of the night was uneasy. Every little sound had us reaching for our weapons. We finally drifted off to sleep, but around 3 a.m., we were jolted awake by the same blood-curdling screams. It was the same fight happening all over again. This time, it lasted even longer. We didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sky lightened, we packed up and left. No one argued. No one joked about being scared. We just left. Looking back, I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was just animals fighting. Maybe we were just spooked. But there was something about it. The unnatural way the sounds carried. The way the fight started again hours later. The growl from that bush. That didn't sit right with me. And it never has. The wind moved through the trees with a steady rhythm, rustling the dry leaves that clung to the branches, whispering in the cold air. It was late fall, and the temperature had dropped just enough to make the nights uncomfortable without proper layers. The campsite had been set up near the edge of a dense forest, not far from a small river that snaked its way through the valley. It was one of the school's regular trips, a 3-day outdoor excursion designed to toughen us up, teach us teamwork, and force us to appreciate the wilderness. I had attended a charter school that emphasized nature education. We weren't exactly roughing it. Our group had been assigned to a Boy Scouts camp, the kind with basic wooden cabins instead of tents. These weren't luxurious by any means. Each was just a rectangle of plywood walls, a plastic sheet roof stretched over the top, and 3 small windows, 2 on the sides, 1 at the back. Inside, there were 4 or 5 wooden bunks, nothing more than frames with flat plywood tops where we laid our sleeping bags. The floors creaked under every step, the wood swollen slightly from years of damp seasons. That night, as we climbed into our bags, the air inside felt tight, like the space was too small for all of us. We were packed in close, 5 of us crammed together, shifting and adjusting to find a comfortable position on the hard surfaces. It had taken a while for the noises outside to die down. Other students laughing, the crackling of the campfire, the occasional crunch of footsteps moving along the dirt paths between the cabins. But eventually, everything faded into quiet, save for the distant sounds of night insects and the occasional wind through the trees. I wasn't the only one having trouble sleeping. Every time I shifted, I heard someone else doing the same, shuffling, sighing, frustrated whispers of fabric as sleeping bags rustled. The air was cold but damp with the humidity that always clung to the woods, making the plastic roof above us crinkle slightly whenever a breeze passed through. Then it happened. A scream, sharp, sudden, and panicked. I shot up so fast my head spun, my body rigid as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. In the dim glow from the moon filtering through the windows, I saw the girl across from me sitting upright, her breath coming in short gasps. But my eyes weren't on her. They were locked on the window just behind her bed. There had been movement, a shadow, a blur, someone ducking down just as we all sat up. For a second, no one moved. The silence was electric, charged with the kind of fear that paralyzed rather than forced action. Then, outside, rapid footsteps pounded away, the sound of someone running through the dirt and dry leaves. Panic surged through me. The others must have felt it too, because in an instant, everyone was scrambling, shoving out of their sleeping bags, pressing against the wooden walls as if it would somehow make them safer. But before anyone could even think of what to do, another sound cut through the night, the heavy thud of footsteps much closer than the fleeing ones. A door slammed open somewhere nearby, a deep voice barking something unintelligible. Then another set of footsteps, this time heavier, more purposeful. A few seconds later, the telltale scuffle of a struggle broke out. The sound of someone hitting the ground, a yelp of pain, and then the unmistakable voice of one of our teachers shouting angrily. We didn't move from the cabin. No one wanted to be the first to open the door. We just stood there, barely breathing, until finally, someone knocked on the door. "It's okay." The voice was firm, familiar. "Come out." We did, slowly, cautiously, and there, under the dim light of a lantern, stood one of the teachers, gripping the arm of a student. I recognized him instantly. He wasn't from our cabin, but I had seen him around plenty of times. He was standing stiffly, his head low, his face pale and full of something between embarrassment and something else, something darker. His eyes darted to the girl who had screamed, then away just as quickly. We found out later that he had been caught watching her through the window, standing just outside for who knows how long. He had ducked when she screamed, tried to run, but the teacher had been nearby, probably doing rounds, and caught him. The kid was sent home immediately, expelled. We never saw him again. The rest of the trip went on as planned, but I never slept right in those cabins again. Every time I laid down, I found myself staring at the windows, wondering if someone was outside, wondering if I would wake up to another shadow shifting in the darkness. That fear followed me for years, and it made the next time even worse. It was years later, but I still loved camping. The fear of that night had never completely left me, but it hadn't stopped me either. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I had taken dozens of trips into the woods, mostly alone, sometimes with friends. I liked the solitude, the quiet. I liked the way the air felt fresher away from the city, the way the night stretched on forever in the darkness of the forest. I had set up camp in a small clearing about a mile off the main road. It was a spot I had used before, near a shallow creek that ran parallel to a game trail. I had built a fire, cooked a small meal, and then settled in for the night, the light of the flames flickering against the trees as I lay back in my sleeping bag. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The forest was quiet aside from the usual sounds of distant animals and wind through the trees. I didn't know until later how wrong I had been. It wasn't until I had returned home that I heard anything about it. A cop showed up at my door, casual but serious, asking if I had seen anything unusual while camping. At first, I thought maybe they were investigating something minor, a lost hiker, maybe. But then the cop asked, "Did you see anyone?" I hadn't. I told him that I hadn't seen a soul the entire time I was out there. That's when he told me an escaped convict had been found less than a mile from where I had been camping. A murderer, a man who had broken out of the prison just a few miles away and had been hiding in those very woods. I remember feeling cold all over, the kind of cold that has nothing to do with the weather, because I hadn't seen anything, hadn't heard anything, but he had been there, somewhere near me, maybe even watching me. The strangest part? I could never find a report on it. Nothing in the news, nothing online. It was like it had never happened. And yet, I know what the cop said. I know where I was that night. And I know that, for reasons I may never understand, I had been incredibly lucky. Because someone had been out there, and I had never even known. I had been working in the desert for nearly 6 months by then, deep in a barren stretch of land so vast that the nearest town was a full day's drive away. It was the kind of place where the wind carved endless dunes into shifting waves of sand, where the sky stretched endlessly overhead with no trees, no hills, nothing but an ocean of ochre-colored dust. There were no roads out here, just faint tire tracks left by our own convoy, disappearing with every gust of wind. It was one of the driest places on Earth, the kind of place where rain was a distant memory and every drop of water had to be planned, measured, rationed. It was remote, desolate, beautiful, a place that had stripped away every unnecessary part of life, leaving behind only the essentials: our work, our camp, and the wilderness. Nights were cold, but stunning. The sky was so clear that the stars felt like they pressed right up against you, close enough to touch. I had never seen a place so vast yet so empty, and yet it never truly felt empty. We were a small team, just 6 of us in total, spending weeks at a time in the field conducting archaeological research. During the day, we worked tirelessly under the brutal sun, chipping away at the sand, cataloging finds, taking notes. At night, we camped near our trucks, setting up a small fire and eating simple meals before rolling out our sleeping bags. Most nights, I preferred to sleep outside rather than inside a tent. The open air was cooler, and I liked the feeling of being beneath the sky. That night had started like any other. After a long day of work, we had grilled some meat over an open fire, letting the flames flicker in the darkness, our voices low, exhausted. The smell of smoke and charred fat lingered in the air as we packed up. We were always careful, always methodical. Every scrap of food was either burned or stored away in the truck to avoid attracting scavengers. The desert wasn't exactly teeming with life, but it had its predators: hyenas, jackals, the occasional big cat. Even though I had never personally seen anything larger than a scavenger, I knew better than to get careless. I was the last one awake. The others had already crawled into their tents, leaving the fire to smolder down to embers. I read by the light of my headlamp for a while, the words blurring together as exhaustion took over. The night was silent except for the occasional whisper of wind through the dunes. I closed my book, switched off my light, and pulled my sleeping bag tight around me, my back against the truck. The ground was hard, the air crisp, the silence was absolute. Then a sound, tiny rustle, so faint it could have been the wind. But something about it didn't feel right. It was too deliberate, too close. My pulse quickened slightly. I flicked on my light and swept it across the sand. Nothing, just empty dunes stretching out into the blackness. I clicked the light off again, listening. The wind sighed softly, but beneath it, I thought I could hear something else. A movement, not loud, not obvious, but present. The kind of sound you don't hear so much as feel. Then I saw them, a pair of eyes, reflecting my headlamp's weak beam for just a second. Then another, and another, a ripple of movement in the darkness. My breath hitched as I sat up, my fingers tightening around the sleeping bag. I flicked my light back on, sweeping it in a slow arc. Jackals, at least 5, maybe more, just 2 meters away. They had fanned out in a rough semicircle around me, their lean bodies barely visible against the sand. I hadn't even heard them approach. One jackal alone wasn't much of a threat. They were scavengers, skittish, opportunistic. But a pack, a hungry pack moving in silence? That was different. I had seen what they could do. Out here, we had come across old carcasses, animals that had been picked apart with terrifying efficiency. Bones stripped clean, gnawed down, scattered. Jackals weren't big, but they were relentless. They could bring down prey much larger than themselves if the conditions were right. And now they were looking at me. My mouth went dry, my pulse hammered in my ears. I knew better than to freeze. Slowly, I moved my arm, scooping up a handful of sand. With a sudden burst, I flung it toward them, yelling as loudly as I could. The nearest ones flinched, darting back a step, but they didn't scatter. They didn't run. I cursed under my breath. My only advantage was the truck at my back. I wasn't surrounded completely, but I needed to move before they grew bolder. In one motion, I lurched to my feet, grabbed my sleeping bag, and stumbled backward toward the nearest tent. The jackals tensed, their bodies shifting in unison, but they didn't pounce. Not yet. I yanked open the tent flap and practically dove inside, my breath coming fast. I could still hear them outside, padding through the sand, sniffing around the site. One of them knocked something over, a metal cup, maybe, a soft clatter in the darkness. For the next 2 hours, I listened to them move. They nosed around the campsite, rustling through whatever hadn't been packed away properly. I could hear them scratching at something, low growls passing between them. Eventually, the noises faded. They had found nothing worth staying for. Still, I didn't move. I lay there, staring at the tent's fabric, waiting. Even when silence returned, even when exhaustion pressed down on me, I couldn't quite bring myself to close my eyes. The next morning, the sun rose like nothing had happened. The dunes glowed gold, the sky a perfect, empty blue. The campsite was still, untouched except for a few scattered footprints and some knocked-over gear. But I knew better. Something had changed. The desert had always felt empty before.
Vast, uninhabited.
Place where we were alone. But I had seen the eyes in the dark, and I knew now that we were never truly alone. Winter camping always seemed like a great idea in theory. The isolation, the challenge, the sheer quiet of a world blanketed in ice and snow. But once you're actually there, in the dead of night, with the cold creeping into your bones and a truck sitting silently in the dark, your perspective changes fast. We had set up camp in a remote part of the state park, far from any main roads or well-traveled trails. It was January, and the forecast had called for temperatures dropping to about 15 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. I was with my friend Ben. We'd been camping together for years, but never in temperatures this extreme. Still, we were prepared, at least we thought we were. We had the right gear, heavy-duty sleeping bags rated for below-zero conditions, thermal clothing, and enough firewood to last through the night. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line, the cold was becoming relentless. Our breath came out in thick plumes, and anything left out for more than a few minutes turned solid with frost. Even our water bottles, which we had kept near the fire, froze within an hour of being at the site. The campsite itself was completely empty. We hadn't seen a single soul since arriving, which wasn't unusual given the season, but it made things eerily quiet. Around 7 p.m., we were sitting by the fire, eating what little warm food we could still manage to heat up, when a set of headlights appeared through the trees. A pickup truck, dark-colored and older-looking, pulled into our campsite. It slowed to a stop about 20 feet away from us, just at the edge of the clearing. Then the lights shut off, the engine cut, and nothing happened. At first, we thought maybe it was a ranger, but there were no markings on the truck, and rangers didn't usually travel alone at night unless they had a reason to. Then we considered that maybe it was another camper looking for a spot, but there were plenty of open sites further down the road. So why park right here in our space and then do nothing? The fire cast flickering shadows against the trees, making it even harder to see into the truck. We tried to glance inside without looking like we were staring, but it was impossible to tell if anyone was in there, let alone what they were doing. The windows were dark, and the truck just sat there, silent, unmoving. Minutes passed, then half an hour. Still nothing. Ben and I tried to act normal, but it was getting harder to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. If someone was inside, why weren't they getting out? If they were lost or needed help, wouldn't they have signaled or spoken up by now? And if they were just messing with us, how long were they planning on sitting there? By 8 p.m., we had decided we weren't just going to sit around waiting to find out. The only problem was we had no cell service. We had noticed it earlier when we'd arrived, but it hadn't seemed like a big deal at the time. Now, it was a major problem. We agreed to leave the site and drive until we could find a signal, but we didn't want to make it obvious that we were leaving out of fear. So we moved slowly. We packed up a few things, acting as if we were just organizing the camp, then casually got into the truck and started it up. The second the headlights illuminated the area, I swear I saw movement inside the other vehicle. Just the faintest shift, like someone ducking down. My stomach tightened, but I didn't say anything. Ben must have seen it too, because as soon as we were a few feet down the dirt road, he hit the gas hard. It took nearly 15 minutes of driving before my phone finally got a single bar of service. Just enough to make a call. I dialed a friend who lived about 30 miles away and gave him the truck's description and license plate number. "There's some guy just sitting in it," he asked. "Yeah, no idea why. Been there over an hour. Hasn't moved. That's messed up." "Yeah, cops," he asked. That was the logical choice, but we hesitated. The truck hadn't done anything illegal. There was no crime in parking at a public campsite, but something about it just felt wrong. We compromised and called the non-emergency number for the local sheriff's department, gave them the details, and asked if they could send someone to check it out. By the time we got back to camp, it was almost 9 p.m. The truck was still there, still silent, but the second we pulled in, its engine roared to life. Headlights flooded our sight. Then, without hesitation, the truck backed out, turned onto the road, and disappeared into the night. Neither of us spoke for a while. The fire had burned low, our breath misting in the cold. Took us a long time to fall asleep, even with the security of the truck nearby. The next morning, we woke up early and decided to pack up and leave. Maybe it was paranoia, but we didn't want to stick around to see if the truck came back. As we were loading up, a sheriff's vehicle pulled into the site. A deputy stepped out, bundled up against the cold, and asked us a few questions about what we had seen. We told him everything. He nodded, taking notes, then told us something that made my stomach drop. That truck's been reported before. Similar situations. No crimes, nothing solid, but always the same behavior. Pulls into campsites, waits, then leaves when someone tries to report it. He didn't have much else to say, but that was enough for us. We finished packing up and left, and I haven't been winter camping since. To this day, I don't know who was in that truck or what they wanted. Maybe it was just some weirdo with nothing better to do. Maybe they were waiting for something or someone, but the part that sticks with me the most is how they left the second we got back. Like they knew we had gone to call for help, like they had been watching, and that thought is worse than anything else. I don't really do the tent thing anymore. Haven't for years. Too much hassle. Instead, I built myself a little cabin out in the woods, about an hour's drive south of the Mackinac Bridge. Remote, quiet, no power, no water, no neighbors close enough to bother me. Just me, my cabin, and the woods. The place is small, 12 by 16 feet. Nothing fancy. Basically a big wooden tent sitting on top of a hill, the highest point for a few miles. I built it myself, put in a little loft to sleep in. It's a good setup. Gets me out of the city, away from work, away from people. Just me, the land, and the deer wandering through in the morning mist. There's a camp down the road a bit. A ranch house some folks from the city bought. Nice enough people. We have some fun during deer season. The old guy that owns it, though, he's something else. Bigfoot guy. Swears up and down that there's a Sasquatch roaming around these woods. I don't buy into that nonsense, but he sure does. Talks about it every chance he gets. Me? I keep my mouth shut and let him have his fun. One night, I had a little too much fun myself. One beer turned into 2, then 6, then a whole case. Didn't mean to drink that much, but hell, I was out there to relax. And sometimes that's just what happens. I remember sitting out by the fire, staring at the embers, listening to the sounds of the woods, the distant rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, the whisper of the wind through the trees. Peaceful. The kind of night that reminds me why I love this place. Sometime around 1 in the morning, I decided to call it a night. Put out the fire, staggered inside, and climbed up into the loft. Window was open. I could hear the deer poking around outside, stepping softly through the leaves. I was just about to drift off when, bam, something slammed into the southwest corner of the cabin. Hard. The whole damn structure shook. It was like someone had taken a battering ram to it. I snapped awake, heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, I just lay there, trying to figure out what the hell just happened. I didn't hear anything after that. No footsteps, no running, just silence. The deer had stopped moving too. The whole forest felt still, unnaturally still. Now, here's the thing, I was drunk. I mean, really drunk. Too drunk to go investigating. Too drunk to do much of anything except stare at the ceiling and let my mind spin in circles. Maybe it was an owl. Maybe a deer ran into the side of the cabin. Maybe I imagined the whole thing. Eventually, the beer won out and I passed out. When I woke up the next morning, my head was pounding, my mouth was dry, and my stomach was a mess. I stumbled outside to get some fresh air and clear my head. That's when I saw it. A muddy blotch, about 9 feet up on the southwest corner of the cabin. Big, smudged, like a handprint, but too damn big to be human. I stood there for a long time just staring at it, trying to make sense of it. I wanted to believe it was something else, anything else. A trick of the mud, a weird stain, some kind of smear from a branch or an animal rubbing against the wood. But it didn't look like that. It looked deliberate, like something had hit the cabin on purpose. Something big. I told myself an owl had slammed into the wall chasing a vole. That made sense. Owls were big, strong, fast. A big bird could hit hard enough to shake the cabin. But owls don't leave handprints. I didn't tell the Bigfoot guy. No way. That would have been the end of it. I'd never hear the end of it. But the thing is, I never really stopped thinking about it either. Every time I'm out at the cabin, I find myself glancing at that corner. Every time the wind shifts and the trees creak just right, I get that feeling in my gut. The one that says something isn't right. The one that says I'm not as alone as I think I am. And every once in a while, late at night, when I'm lying up in the loft with the window open, listening to the deer moving through the brush, I wonder if I'll hear that sound again. That deep, heavy BAM against the wall. I rented the cabin because I needed to get away. Life had been weighing on me in ways I couldn't explain. City noise, work stress, people, I was sick of it all. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Just packed a bag, booked a cabin online, and drove out into the woods. The listing described it as secluded, perfect for solitude. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive was long. Roads turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. Trees thickened on both sides, blocking out the sky. My GPS lost signal an hour before I arrived. The last few miles were slow, my tires skidding slightly in the mud from last night's rain. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. It was a simple structure, wooden, one-story, with a slanted roof and a porch. A single window at the front. The paint was peeling, the porch steps creaked under my weight. The door was stiff but unlocked. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dust. There was a bed, a small table, a wood stove, and a kitchen with a rusting sink. No TV, no Wi-Fi, no cell service. Perfect. I dropped my bag on the bed and decided to check out the surroundings. There was no one for miles. Just trees, endless and silent. I liked that. It was what I wanted. That first night, I sat on the porch with a beer, listening to the wind move through the branches. There was a calmness I hadn't felt in years. When it got too cold, I went inside, locked the door, and fell asleep almost instantly. I woke up at some point in the night. No reason, just a feeling. The cabin was silent. No wind, no creaks, just heavy, suffocating stillness. I stayed like that for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening. Eventually, I rolled over and forced myself back to sleep. Morning came and everything seemed normal. I made coffee on the stove, ate a granola bar, and decided to explore. There were trails behind the cabin leading deeper into the woods. I followed one for a while, stepping over roots, pushing branches out of my way. Then I found something strange. It was a clearing. Not natural, something about it felt deliberate. The ground was flattened, dirt disturbed like something had been dragged. In the center, a ring of stones, blackened as if from fire. Around the edges of the clearing, small wooden stakes jutted from the ground, each one topped with something dark. As I stepped closer, my stomach twisted. Bones. Animal, probably. Small, brittle, stripped clean. But something about it was wrong. The way they were placed, almost organized. Not scattered like a wild animal's meal. Placed. I didn't stay long. Walked back to the cabin, faster than before. The stillness that I had found comforting now felt heavy, like something pressing down on my chest. The rest of the day I stayed inside. Read a book, forced myself to eat. Told myself it was just some old campsite. But at the back of my mind, something itched. An unease I couldn't shake. That night I woke up again. Same feeling, like something was off. I listened. Wind, distant rustling. But then, beneath it, something else. A soft sound. Footsteps. Not an animal. They were slow, deliberate, moving outside the cabin. I held my breath. The footsteps circled once, twice, then stopped. Minutes passed. My heart pounded in my ears. I didn't move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard them again, walking away, fading into the woods. I barely slept after that. Morning was a relief. I stepped onto the porch, eyes scanning the treeline. Nothing. No footprints in the mud. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just on edge from the clearing. I decided I had enough of the woods. I packed my bag, threw it in the car, and turned the key. The engine sputtered but didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I checked under the hood, though I didn't know what I was looking for. Everything seemed fine, but the car wouldn't start. Panic crept in. The nearest town was miles away. No cell service. No way to call for help. I took a breath. I had enough food for a few days. Maybe the engine was just cold. I try again later. By afternoon, clouds rolled in, dark and heavy. Rain started slow, then turned into a downpour. The forest became a blur of shifting gray. The wind howled through the trees. I stayed inside, listening to the storm, trying not to think about last night. Then, in the middle of it all, a sound cut through the rain. A knock, soft, once, twice, then silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. I forced myself to peek through the window. The rain distorted everything, but I saw no one. The trees swayed violently. Maybe a branch had hit the door. That's what I told myself. By nightfall, the rain had stopped, but the air was thick with mist. My car still wouldn't start. The thought of walking to town crossed my mind, but I knew the trails would be flooded. I had to wait. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound put me on edge. The wind, creaking wood, the occasional patter of water dripping from the trees. Then, around 3 a.m., something else. A slow, dragging sound. came from the back of the cabin. Long, deliberate, a heavy weight pulled across the ground. I gripped the blanket, forcing myself not to move. The sound circled around to the front, stopped outside the door. Silence. Then the knob turned. Locked. Thank God I had locked it. Whoever or whatever it was stood there, waiting. I could hear breathing. Soft, shallow. Then, just like before, footsteps. Slow. Walking away. I stayed awake until sunrise. The second there was enough light, I grabbed my bag, shoved everything inside, and stepped outside. My car still wouldn't start. No choice left. I walked, hours, through mud, over roots. My legs ached. I didn't stop. Couldn't. When I finally reached the main road, I nearly collapsed. A truck passed, slowed when the driver saw me. He rolled down his window, concern on his face. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, breathless, heart still hammering. "Car broke down," I managed. "Need a ride." He let me in. I didn't look back at the trees, didn't say a word as he drove me to town. I never went back for my car, left it there. I called the rental company, told them where to find it, then blocked the number when they tried to ask questions. I still don't know who was out there, and I don't want to know. A few years ago, I went camping with 10 friends at a secluded hot spring in the mountains of Northern California. It was a Friday the 13th, and the sky held a full moon. The drive to our campsite was just over an hour, and since I had work the next day, I planned to take it easy on the drinking. The place was beautiful, steam rising from the springs, surrounded by rolling hills and trees. We set up camp away from everyone else, cracked open some beers, and soaked in the springs as the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was perfect. After dark, a group of us decided to take a night walk. The moon was bright enough that we didn't need much light, and the idea of exploring the mountains under the stars sounded magical. But getting everyone ready was a mess. Some people were too drunk or distracted, and only 3 of us ended up going. Me, my friend Claire, her boyfriend Eric, and Eric's dog, Luna. We had one flashlight between us. In hindsight, we should have each had one, but we figured the moonlight would be enough. We walked uphill for 10 minutes before coming across a cattle guard. A metal grate in the ground meant to keep livestock from crossing. We picked up Luna and stepped over it. Beyond the cattle guard, a narrow dirt trail wound through the trees. A barbed wire fence ran alongside it, which should have been a warning to turn back. But we didn't. We kept going. A few minutes in, we heard something. A rustling sound ahead. Not a breeze through the trees, not a small animal, but something big. We stopped, scanning the brush with our flashlight. That's when we saw them. Eyes, 2 glowing eyes reflecting the light. It took a second for my brain to register what I was looking at. The body was low to the ground, muscles tensed. It was a mountain lion. It was close, too close. We froze, staring at it, and it stared right back. Instinct kicked in, we backed away slowly, careful not to turn our backs. But Luna had other plans. The moment she saw the mountain lion, she bolted to the side, running parallel to us through the brush. I could see her moving beside us, a dark shape in the moonlight. Then I realized Luna was next to us. So what was that running alongside us? I swung the flashlight toward the movement, and my stomach dropped. Another pair of glowing eyes. A second mountain lion. Smaller, but just as dangerous. We had walked straight into a mother and her cub. I felt the air leave my lungs. We were trapped, moving backward, but there was only so much space before we hit the barbed wire fence. The mountain lions weren't charging, but they weren't leaving either. Every step we took, they took too. Silent, watching. We reached the fence. Nowhere else to go. Behind us was another campsite, empty but with a few tents and a car parked nearby. The only way out was over the fence. We got Luna over first. She scrambled through, unharmed. Eric went next, but his jeans caught on the wire, and he sliced his leg open. Blood soaked through the fabric. Claire and I followed, tearing our clothes in the process. We didn't care. We were over, but we weren't safe. The mountain lions were still there, pacing on the other side of the fence. We didn't know if they'd try to follow. We didn't wait to find out. We ran straight for the car in the empty campsite, yanked the doors open, and jumped inside. Eric slammed his hand on the horn, blasting the sound into the night, over and over, anything to scare them off. We yelled too, making sure anyone nearby knew what was happening. But nobody came out, not a single person. Claire swore she heard something, a muffled scream, like someone was trying to call for help. But Eric wasn't listening. He just wanted to leave. I wasn't sure what to believe. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was nothing. But maybe it wasn't. We stayed in the car for a few minutes before cautiously stepping out. The campsite still looked abandoned. No movement, no lights, just empty tents and silence. It was eerie. We left quickly, sticking to the road this time. I didn't breathe properly until we were back at our own camp. The others were still drinking, laughing, having a great time. Meanwhile, I was shaking, my heart still hammering in my chest. Every rustling noise made me jump. The fear wouldn't let go. I climbed into the car and locked the doors. But I wasn't alone for long. Claire got in, bringing a bottle of tequila and a handful of mushrooms. She sat beside me, covered in gnats from the cracked sunroof, and told me if we were going to die that night, we might as well be happy about it. I laughed. It wasn't funny, but I laughed. And somehow, I got out of the car and joined everyone by the fire. I drank. I tried to have fun, but I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing things in the darkness, kept picturing those glowing eyes watching from the trees. The next morning, I was hungover as hell. I no-showed at work, got fired, didn't care. It was worth it, but I still have nightmares about those mountain lions. And sometimes, I still wonder about that empty campsite, about why no one came out, and about what Claire really heard that night. The plan was simple, a solo hike through the deep wilderness. 3 days, 2 nights, nothing but me, my backpack, and the trail. I had done hikes like this before, but never this deep into the mountains. The area was remote, untouched. No cell service, no people, just miles of forest stretching in every direction. That's exactly what I wanted. I parked my car at the trailhead just after sunrise. The morning air was crisp, the kind that filled your lungs with a biting cold before the sun had time to warm it up. My pack was heavy, filled with enough food, water, and gear to last the trip. The first few miles were easy, a steady incline with well-marked paths. I moved fast, enjoying the quiet, the way my footsteps and breathing were the only sounds around me. Around midday, I reached a clearing with a small stream. I refilled my water bottle, sat on a fallen log, and ate a granola bar. The silence here was different. It wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, like the woods were listening. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the remoteness of the area. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. By late afternoon, I had covered about 10 miles. The sun was getting low, and I needed to find a place to set up camp. I found a decent spot off the trail, a small flat area near a dense patch of trees. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and ate a quick meal. As the sky darkened, I sat watching the flames, listening to the crackling wood and the distant rustle of leaves. Normal forest sounds, but something felt off. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation. But then I heard it, a branch snapping, close. I froze, ears straining. Another snap, then silence. My eyes scanned the tree line, but there was nothing, just darkness pressing against the fire's glow. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, but my gut told me something else, something bigger, something watching. I grabbed my knife and flashlight and scanned the woods. Nothing moved. The fire flickered, casting shifting shadows that played tricks on my eyes. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I forced myself to relax. It was fine. It had to be. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay there listening. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crack made my muscles tense. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. I woke up just before dawn. The fire had burned out, and the air was freezing. I unzipped the tent, stepped out, and stretched. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They circled my camp, stopping just outside my tent. Bare feet. The prints were deep, clear in the dirt. Someone or something had stood there, just inches from where I had been sleeping. My stomach twisted. I wasn't alone out here. I packed fast. No breakfast, no fire. Just stuffed my gear into my pack and got moving. I wanted to believe it was some lost hiker, but what kind of hiker walks barefoot through the freezing woods in the middle of the night? I pushed that thought away and picked up my pace. By midday, I had covered more ground than planned. I wanted out of these woods. Something wasn't right. The silence was heavier now, pressing in on me. I didn't hear birds, didn't see squirrels or deer. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then I saw it. A shape standing just off the trail, deep in the trees. Too far to see clearly, but close enough that I knew it wasn't an animal. Tall, unmoving, watching me, my legs locked up. My throat went dry. I didn't want to stare, but I couldn't look away. I lifted my hand, gripping the knife at my belt, ready to run or fight or do whatever I needed to do. But when I blinked, it was gone. Just trees, just emptiness. I forced myself forward, my pulse hammering. I kept my pace steady, but my body screamed at me to run. I fought that urge. Running meant panic. Panic meant mistakes. For hours, I moved fast, barely stopping for water. My legs ached. My breath came in sharp gasps, but I didn't stop. The feeling of being watched never left. Every so often, I'd catch glimpses. Something shifting between trees, a shadow that shouldn't be there, the snap of a twig just behind me. I wasn't alone, and whoever, whatever it was, wasn't letting me go. By late afternoon, I was close to the trailhead. I could feel it. I pushed harder, practically jogging now. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. My car. It was still there, but something was wrong. The driver's side door was open. I knew for a fact I had locked it. I never left my car unlocked in the wilderness. My hands were shaking as I approached. The inside was trashed. My backpack, which I had left inside, was ripped open, its contents scattered. My glove compartment had been emptied, papers thrown everywhere. But what stopped me cold was what was on the windshield. A single handprint, smudged, dirty, bare, the same size as the footprints around my tent. I didn't wait. I jumped into the car, turned the key, and peeled out, kicking up gravel as I sped down the dirt road. My heart pounded, every nerve screaming at me to get as far away as possible. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. Only then did I pull over, hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I sat there, trying to calm my breathing, trying to make sense of what had happened. I never reported it. What would I even say? That someone, barefoot, had stalked me through miles of wilderness, left no trace except for footprints and a handprint? That they had been out there, waiting, watching? I don't hike alone anymore, and I never go back to those woods. I had always loved hiking alone. The quiet, the rhythm of my footsteps on dirt trails, the sense of being truly disconnected. It was something I needed. After working long hours at a job that drained the life out of me, these hikes were my way of resetting my mind. But there was one hike that changed the way I saw the wilderness forever. It was late September, just as summer was dying out and autumn was creeping in. The air was crisp but not too cold, the kind of weather that made hiking perfect. I had my backpack stocked with the essentials: water, some protein bars, a knife, a first aid kit, and my phone with a fully charged power bank. I wasn't reckless. I always made sure I was prepared. I chose a trail that wasn't well known. I had done my research and found a long, winding route through a dense section of forest that promised great views and a peaceful, solitary experience. The trail was roughly 12 miles, a loop that would bring me back to my car by evening if I kept a steady pace. The first few miles were everything I had hoped for. The forest was alive but not overwhelming. Birds chirped above, leaves rustled in the gentle breeze, and the occasional squirrel darted across the path. It was perfect. I took my time, stopping occasionally to take in the view when the trees opened up to reveal glimpses of distant mountains. About 5 miles in, I noticed the trail narrowing. The dirt path became rockier, and the trees seemed to grow closer together. There was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. The sounds of birds had faded, and the forest felt quieter, heavier. I didn't think much of it at first. I had been on plenty of trails where the density of trees muffled sound. But the silence stuck with me. Around mile 6, I came across something odd. A shoe. It was old, weathered, and half buried in the dirt. It looked like it had been there for years. At first, I assumed it was just some lost junk, but then I saw another one a few feet ahead, and then another. A trail of discarded shoes, all in different sizes, all facing the same direction. I told myself it was just weird litter. Maybe some campers had dumped their old shoes here for some reason. But something about it felt wrong. It was too deliberate. The shoes weren't scattered randomly. They formed a rough path leading deeper into the forest. I ignored them and kept walking. I wasn't here to dwell on mysteries. I just wanted to finish my hike and get back before dark. By mile 7, I realized I hadn't seen a single trail marker in a while. That was strange. The trail wasn't well maintained, but it was still a marked route. I backtracked a bit, scanning the trees for the usual blazes of paint that signified the correct path. Nothing. I pulled out my phone to check my GPS. No signal. That was expected. This deep into the forest, service was spotty. I wasn't worried yet. I had a good sense of direction, and I knew if I just followed my own footprints back, I'd be fine. But as I turned to retrace my steps, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. My footprints were gone. The dirt was disturbed, sure, but not in a way that clearly showed my tracks. It was as if the forest had swallowed them up. A wave of unease settled in. I took a deep breath and forced myself to think rationally. Maybe the wind had shifted the top layer of dirt. Maybe the ground here was just too dry to hold proper tracks. I wasn't lost, I just needed to focus. I decided to keep moving forward, hoping I'd find another marker soon. But the deeper I went, the worse it got. The trees felt like they were closing in, and the silence was deafening. No birds, no wind, just my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. And then I saw it. A backpack, old, torn, slumped against the base of a tree. It had been there for a long time. The fabric was faded, and the zippers were rusted. I crouched down and nudged it with my foot. Empty. But next to it was something that sent a chill up my spine. An old water bottle, the kind with a flip-top lid, cracked and dry. And beside that, a rusted knife, its blade half buried in the dirt. I straightened up quickly. Something wasn't right. Someone had been here long ago, and they had left in a hurry. I kept moving faster now. My pulse was pounding in my ears, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to get out. I wasn't lost. I just had to find a trail marker, any marker. And then I heard it, a branch snapping, not far behind me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. That wasn't an animal. It was deliberate, a slow, careful step. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance over my shoulder without making it obvious. There was nothing there, just trees. But the feeling was undeniable. I wasn't alone. I picked up my pace, moving as quickly as I could without breaking into a run. Running was a bad idea. Running meant panic. Running meant noise. I needed to be quiet. Another sound. Closer. Not footsteps exactly, just movement. A shift in the air. The sense of something watching me, just beyond my line of sight. I gripped my knife in my pocket. I wasn't going down without a fight. Then, up ahead, something caught my eye. A bright orange ribbon tied to a tree. A marker. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't slow down. I moved straight toward it, then spotted another one a few feet ahead. The trail wasn't lost. I had just veered off course. I followed the markers, my heart pounding, my ears straining for any sound behind me. The presence I had felt was still there, but it wasn't following. It was just watching. I don't know how long it took, but eventually, I saw the break in the trees. The parking lot. My car. I didn't stop until I was inside, locking the doors the second I slammed them shut. I sat there for a long time, breathing hard, staring at the tree line. I didn't see anything, but I knew deep down that something had been there. Something had been watching me. I never went back to that trail, and I never hiked alone again. I drove up the winding dirt road, my tires crunching over the loose gravel as I climbed higher into the woods. The trees grew thicker the deeper I went, their branches stretching out over the path like skeletal fingers. The cabin was about a mile off the main road, far from anyone, far from any town. That was the point. I needed to be alone for a while, just me, the trees, and silence. I had rented the cabin for a week, looking for a break from the city, from people, from everything. The listing described it as secluded, off-grid, and a true escape. That's what I wanted. No phone calls, no emails, no interruptions. Just the quiet hum of nature. As I pulled up, the place looked exactly like the pictures. A small wooden cabin, faded with age but still standing strong. A porch with a single rocking chair. The roof sagged a little on one side, but it was nothing too concerning. The forest loomed all around, thick and dark. There was no cell service out here, no Wi-Fi, just the cabin, the woods, and me. I cut the engine, and for a moment the silence was overwhelming. No traffic noise, no voices, just the occasional rustling of leaves. I grabbed my bag, stepped out, and inhaled deeply. The air smelled damp, earthy, fresh. The key was exactly where the owner said it would be, under the third step of the porch. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood. There was a fireplace against the far wall, a couch that looked like it had been there for decades, and a small kitchenette. The bedroom was down the hall, the bathroom next to it. Simple, isolated, perfect. I set my bag down, walked to the window and looked outside. Just trees. No other cabins, no roads in sight. It felt like I was the only person on Earth. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped. The woods were quiet, almost unnervingly so. I lit a fire in the fireplace, watching as the flames curled around the dry logs. Shadows danced along the cabin walls. It should have been comforting, but something about it unsettled me. Maybe it was just the loneliness setting in. I wasn't used to this kind of quiet. I tried to sleep but kept waking up. Every little sound made my ears perk up. A branch snapping, leaves crunching. I told myself it was just animals. Deer, maybe a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. But I kept my hunting knife next to my bed, just in case. The second night, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Not mine. I had barely walked around since arriving. The prints were fresh, leading from the woods to the porch, stopping right at the door. I stared at them for a long time, my mind racing. Maybe another hiker had passed through. Maybe a hunter. But why come right up to the cabin? I checked the door. It was locked. Nothing inside seemed out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing outside, just beyond the trees, watching. I kept the fire going, the knife in my hand under the blanket. The third day, I hiked out a little, trying to clear my head. I found another set of footprints, deeper in the woods. Same size as the ones near my cabin. Someone had been out here, recently. I turned back, quickening my pace. My heart was hammering in my chest. I locked the door as soon as I got inside and pushed the couch in front of it. It felt ridiculous, but I didn't care. That night, I woke to the sound of something tapping on the window. I froze. The fire had burned down to embers. The cabin was nearly pitch black. My breath felt too loud. I reached for my knife. The tapping came again. A slow, deliberate sound. Not wind, not an animal. It was a pattern, like someone was testing if I was awake. I didn't move. I listened. The tapping stopped. A long silence followed. Then the doorknob rattled. My stomach dropped. Someone was out there. I gripped the knife tighter, barely breathing. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time. The couch blocked it from opening, but I could hear them trying. Then silence. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. My muscles ached from holding so still. I didn't move until the first light crept through the window. I pushed the couch away slowly, listening. I cracked the door open. No footprints. No sign anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. I packed my bag. I didn't care that I had paid for a full week. I wasn't staying another night. I threw everything into my car, started the engine, and drove, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I hit the highway miles away. Only then did I pull over, my heart still racing. I checked my phone. Service returned. Dozens of missed calls, messages. But one notification made my blood run cold. The cabin's security camera had sent an alert. The owner had told me it was broken, just there to scare off trespassers. But the app showed a new recording. I clicked it. The screen was dark, grainy. Then, a shape moved near the porch. A figure. Someone standing at the door, facing it for a long time, motionless. Then they turned, looking directly into the camera, and smiled. I had been driving for hours, and the deeper I got into the forest, the less my phone had signal. The GPS gave up a while ago, leaving me with printed directions I had barely glanced at before leaving. The road was narrow, barely more than a dirt path, with trees pressing in from both sides. The sky had turned a dull gray, the kind that made everything feel colder than it was. I had rented a cabin for the weekend. The listing described it as secluded, perfect for peace and quiet. And at the time, that sounded exactly like what I needed. Work had been draining. My apartment felt suffocating. And I just wanted a few days where I didn't have to hear another person's voice. But now, as I drove deeper into the woods, I started wondering if I had made a mistake. The last stretch of the road was the worst. It was barely wide enough for my car, with roots and rocks jutting out. If I got stuck out here, I had no idea how I'd get help. I hadn't passed another car for at least an hour. When I finally reached the cabin, relief washed over me. It was small, just one story, made of dark wood with a metal roof. There was a small porch, and beyond it, a lake stretched out, still and silent. It was beautiful in a lonely sort of way. I grabbed my bag and went inside. The air smelled like old wood and dust. The cabin was simple. A bed against the far wall, a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just me and the quiet. The first few hours were nice. I made coffee, sat on the porch, and listened to the water lap against the shore. But as the afternoon faded, an uneasiness settled over me. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was just being in an unfamiliar place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started with small things. A creak from the other side of the cabin when I wasn't moving. The feeling of being watched when I looked out into the trees. A branch snapping in the distance. I told myself it was just the forest settling, the wind, animals. That night, I locked the door and double-checked the windows before going to bed. The silence was suffocating. In the city, there was always noise, cars, voices, sirens. Out here, the quiet had weight to it. Every small sound seemed louder. I woke up in the middle of the night to something tapping against the window. My heart pounded as I lay still, listening. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was testing to see if the glass would break. I didn't move. I just stared at the ceiling, barely breathing. After a minute, the tapping stopped. I stayed awake for hours, listening. I wanted to believe it was a tree branch, but there were no trees close enough to the window. The next morning, I checked outside. There were no footprints, no signs that anything had been near the cabin. I almost convinced myself I imagined it. The day passed slowly. I tried to distract myself, reading, walking along the lake, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept catching movement from the corner of my eye, but every time I turned, there was nothing. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair. It felt ridiculous, but it made me feel a little safer. I lay in bed, listening. The wind picked up, making the trees groan. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The tapping. This time, it was at the back window. Slow, rhythmic. My stomach twisted. I reached for my phone, but of course, there was no signal. I lay there, frozen, listening. Then came the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving from the back of the cabin to the front porch. I held my breath. The chair against the door suddenly felt useless. The footsteps stopped. Then a long, slow exhale right outside the door. I couldn't move. My hands gripped the blanket so tightly my fingers ached. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I didn't sleep. I just lay there waiting. When the first light of dawn filtered through the window, I finally moved. My body was stiff, sore. I forced myself to get up and check outside. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of anything. But I knew what I heard. I packed my things in record time. The weekend wasn't worth it. I grabbed my keys and went to the car, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door. The drive back felt longer. Every shadow between the trees looked like it was watching me. I didn't breathe easy until I saw the first sign of civilization. When I got home, I checked the listing again. The pictures looked the same, the description was the same, but something was different. The comments. A new one had been added the night before. Did anyone else hear footsteps outside at night? I shut my laptop. I didn't need to know the answer. I needed to get away. Life had been weighing down on me, and when my uncle offered his old hunting cabin in the middle of nowhere for a weekend, I took the chance. I packed enough food and water for a few days, threw my rifle in the truck just in case, and drove out. The road was rough, mostly dirt and gravel, winding through miles of dense forest. The farther I went, the less I saw of civilization. No houses, no power lines, no signs of people. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the trees. It was a small, one-room structure made of dark, weathered wood. The windows were old and slightly warped, the glass smudged with dirt. A single porch light flickered weakly as I stepped up to the door. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of dust and aged wood. The furniture was sparse. A bed against the wall, a small table with 2 chairs, and a rusty wood-burning stove. A set of deer antlers hung above the doorway, the only decoration in the place. I locked the door behind me and set my bags down. The first thing I did was check my phone. No service, as expected. That was fine. I was here to be alone. No distractions, no noise, just me and the quiet of the woods. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire in the stove, cooked some canned soup, and sat at the table, listening to the wind outside. Occasionally, I heard the distant howl of a coyote or the snap of a branch in the woods, but nothing unusual. I read a book until my eyes grew heavy, then stretched out on the bed, my rifle within reach, just in case. I woke up sometime after midnight, feeling off. Not scared, exactly, but alert, like something had pulled me from my sleep. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. The wind had stopped. The forest outside was completely silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just nothing. I sat up slowly, listening. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of leaves outside, something moving close to the cabin. I grabbed my rifle and crept to the window, pressing my face to the glass. The porch light barely illuminated the front yard, but I could make out the trees, the dirt path leading back to my truck. Nothing else. Another crunch, closer this time. I held my breath. The sound was coming from the right side of the cabin, near the back. I moved carefully to the back window, my heart pounding. The glass was dirty, but I could see movement, something shifting between the trees. A dark shape, low to the ground, moving slowly. A bear? Maybe, but something felt wrong. The shape didn't move like a bear. It was too smooth, too deliberate. Then, as I watched, it stopped, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then I saw it, ahead, just barely visible in the dim light, peeking out from behind a tree. Watching me, I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the rifle. I wasn't sure what I was looking at. Could have been an animal, could have been a person. Either way, I wasn't about to find out. I backed away from the window and locked the door, checking the latch twice. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it through the front window, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. When I turned it toward the back window, I froze. The head was gone, but the shape was closer now. I kept the light on it for a full minute, waiting for it to move. Didn't. It just stood there, half hidden behind the trees. I closed the blinds, my hands shaking. Whatever it was, I wasn't going outside. Not tonight. I sat on the bed, my back against the wall, rifle across my lap. The silence stretched on. Hours passed, but I didn't sleep. Every so often, I'd hear a faint rustling outside, but I refused to look. I just waited, gripping the rifle, forcing myself to stay awake. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the blinds. The moment I could see outside, I went to the window. Nothing. The trees stood still, the ground undisturbed. But something was off. The air felt heavy, wrong. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something had been out there, and I had no intention of staying to find out what. I packed up my things, throwing everything into my truck as fast as I could. Before leaving, I did one last check around the cabin. When I walked to the back, my stomach dropped. Footprints, human footprints, leading from the woods to the back of the cabin. I didn't stop to think. I got in my truck, started the engine, and drove, fast. I didn't look back. I didn't tell my uncle what happened. I didn't tell anyone. But I know what I saw, and I know, without a doubt, that I wasn't alone out there. It started on a cold Tuesday morning in early November. I was driving down a back road through the outskirts of town, heading to a job site about 30 miles away. I work as a private contractor, mostly handling electrical work for homes and small businesses. The road was empty, lined with bare trees and scattered farmhouses, some abandoned, others barely standing. There was a thick fog hanging low, making it difficult to see much beyond the road signs and fence posts along the way. I remember checking my fuel gauge and realizing I was nearly out of gas. I hadn't noticed it before leaving, and now there weren't any stations nearby. I sighed and kept driving, hoping to come across one before my truck completely gave out. A few miles ahead, I spotted a rusted-out gas station sign, the kind that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The place itself was just as bad. The windows were covered in grime, the walls cracked, and the single pump looked ancient. But I had no choice. I pulled in, turned off the truck, and stepped outside. The air smelled damp, like old leaves and stagnant water. There were no other cars, no signs of life, just the wind whistling through the cracks in the building. I walked up to the pump and saw it still had a card reader, though it looked questionable at best. I slid my card in, waited, and nothing happened. I tried again, still nothing. Frustrated, I looked around, hoping someone was inside the station. The door was slightly open, the interior dark. I hesitated but decided to step inside. The moment I pushed the door open, the smell hit me. It was a mix of mildew, dust, and something else. Something metallic like rust or blood. The lights flickered weakly, revealing a narrow space cluttered with old shelves stocked with faded snack wrappers and dust-covered bottles of soda. Behind the counter, there was an old register, but no one was there. "Hello," I called out. No answer. I walked toward the counter, feeling uneasy. There was an old notebook lying open next to the register. I glanced at it and saw messy handwriting, though I couldn't make out much of what it said. The only part one could read clearly was a date, yesterday's date. That didn't make sense. This place looked like no one had been here for years. A sound came from the back, a slow creaking, like someone shifting their weight on a weak floorboard. My breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to leave, but curiosity kept me there. I stepped around the counter and looked toward a narrow hallway leading to the back rooms. A dim, yellow light flickered at the end, just barely illuminating the outline of a doorway. I took a step forward, and that's when I saw it. A pair of boots. Not just any boots, someone's feet. They were sticking out from behind the doorway, unmoving. My chest tightened. I didn't want to get closer, but my legs moved on their own. I inched forward, heart pounding, until I could see more. A man lay on the floor, motionless. His clothes were dirty, covered in dark stains. His face was turned away, but there was something wrong about the way he was positioned. Like he had fallen, but not naturally. I swallowed hard and took a step back, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. Too quiet. My mind screamed at me to leave. Then I heard breathing. Not mine. Someone else's. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere close. I turned sharply, scanning the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. Someone was there, watching. The hair on my arms stood up. My fingers twitched, wanting to reach for something, anything, to defend myself. But I was unarmed, completely exposed. I forced myself to move, stepping backwards slowly toward the entrance. The breathing didn't stop. It didn't get closer, but it didn't go away either. It just lingered in the air, steady, controlled. I turned and walked fast, my boots echoing against the linoleum floor. I made it outside and slammed the truck door shut, locking it. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't start. "Come on, come on," I muttered, trying again. The third time, the truck roared to life, and I threw it into reverse. As I backed away, I looked toward the gas station one last time. The door I had left open was now closed, and in the window there was a shape, a figure standing there, watching me. I didn't stop to think. I hit the gas and drove off, not caring how much fuel I had left. My heart didn't stop racing until I was miles away. The station nothing but a memory in my rearview mirror. I never went back. I don't know what I saw that day, and I don't want to know. But I've had nightmares ever since. And in every one, I hear that breathing. Steady, controlled. Always just close enough to remind me it never really left. I should have never come here alone. It seemed like a good idea at the time. A week off work, a break from the noise of the city, and some peace and quiet in the woods. My friend James owned the cabin, said it was old but sturdy, far enough from town to be peaceful but close enough if I needed anything. "You'll love it," he had told me. "No phone service, no distractions, just you and nature." I packed light, some food, water, a flashlight, and a book I had been meaning to read for months. The drive up was uneventful. The dirt road stretched for miles through the dense trees before opening into a clearing where the cabin stood. It looked just like James described. An old wooden structure, small but solid, with a porch that creaked under my weight. The first day was uneventful. I set up my things, checked the cabinets for supplies. James had left some canned food and a few bottles of water, and took a short walk around the property. The trees were thick, the air cool and still. I didn't see another house or cabin in any direction, just miles of unbroken forest. That first night, I sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the woods. Crickets, distant owls, the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. I felt calm, more relaxed than I had in a long time. When I finally went inside, I locked the door, lit the old oil lamp, and read until I felt sleepy. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard something outside, a crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. My eyes snapped open. The sound was close, just outside the window. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear past the silence that followed. Nothing. Maybe a deer, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon. But my mind wouldn't let it go. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and walked to the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees. Nothing moved, just stillness. I went back to bed but didn't sleep well. Every little noise made me tense up. By the time morning came, I felt exhausted. I spent the next day exploring. The forest was thick, the trees towering high, their branches tangling together to block most of the sunlight. I found a small creek about a quarter mile from the cabin and spent some time there, skipping rocks and trying to shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. That night, it happened again. This time, it was louder, more distinct. Footsteps, not the quick, skittering steps of an animal, but slow, deliberate crunches on the forest floor. I sat up in bed, gripping the flashlight. My breath felt tight in my chest. Then, a knock at the door. 3 slow, heavy knocks. I froze. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. but there wasn't one. No one should be here. No one knew I was here except James, and he was back in the city. My phone had no service. I was alone. Another knock. I turned off the lamp, my pulse hammering in my ears. My body refused to move. I just sat there in the dark, barely breathing. The knock stopped. I waited, gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, from outside, the sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was the wind rattling the wood. Maybe an animal. The idea of someone being out there, watching, knocking, was too much to accept. I spent the day on edge, glancing toward the trees every few minutes, feeling like I was being watched. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair. I closed the curtains. I kept the flashlight and a knife beside me in bed. I told myself that if I heard something, I wouldn't investigate. I would stay put. But when the knocking came, I couldn't ignore it. 3 slow, heavy knocks. I gripped the knife. My heart pounded so loud I thought whoever was outside could hear it. Silence. Then something new. The sound of metal rattling. The door handle. Someone was trying to get in. I held my breath. The handle twisted, jerked, then stopped. The silence stretched on. Then, footsteps, slow and steady, moving around the cabin. I heard them on the porch, then by the side window. A shadow passed by the curtain, too tall to be an animal. Then the footsteps stopped. I sat there, knife in hand, every muscle in my body locked in place. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. By morning, there were footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Human footprints. I wanted to leave, but my car was parked a short walk away, and the thought of running through the trees with someone out there terrified me. Instead, I stayed inside all day, barely eating, barely moving. That night, I didn't turn off the lamp. I sat in the corner, watching the door, knife in my hand. The knocks came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I didn't move. Then the door handle twisted. The footsteps circled the cabin. Then silence. But this time, they didn't leave. I sat there, waiting. My eyes burned from exhaustion. Every creak, every shift of the wood made my heart jolt. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Then something new. Breathing. Close. Right outside the door. Slow, deep breaths. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight, turned it on, and shined it at the window. The beam caught someone, standing just beyond the porch. A man. He was tall, his clothes dark and loose. His face was shadowed, but I saw the way he stood, still and waiting. I didn't think. I grabbed my car keys and ran. I didn't stop to look back. I threw the door open, sprinted through the trees, crashing through branches and roots, the flashlight bouncing in my grip. My car was just ahead. As I reached it, I fumbled with the keys, shaking so hard I almost dropped them. I yanked the door open, jumped inside, and locked it. Then, in the glow of my headlights, I saw him, standing at the edge of the trees, watching. I didn't wait. I started the engine, slammed it into reverse, and tore out of there, dirt and gravel flying. I didn't stop until I reached the city. James didn't believe me at first. He thought I had just freaked myself out. But when he went to check on the cabin, he found something I hadn't noticed in my rush to escape. On the cabin door, scratched into the wood, were 3 deep gouges. 3 straight lines. 3 marks, like someone had been keeping count. I had been planning the trip for months. A solo camping weekend, deep in the woods, away from the noise and distractions of life. Just me, the trees, and the sounds of nature. I packed light, just the essentials. My tent, sleeping bag, some food, water, a hunting knife, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I had a map too, though I had memorized most of the trails. The area I was heading to wasn't popular with campers, which was exactly why I chose it. I wanted isolation. The drive was long but peaceful. As I got closer to my destination, the paved roads turned to dirt, and I knew I was getting far from civilization. I reached a small clearing near a trailhead, parked my truck, and set off on foot. The weight of my backpack pressed into my shoulders, but I welcomed it. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Birds chirped in the distance, and the occasional rustling of leaves hinted at unseen wildlife. I hiked for nearly 2 hours before I found the perfect spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing with just enough open space for my tent. Tall trees surrounded it, offering both shelter and a sense of security. A nearby creek provided fresh water, and the thick underbrush suggested that few, if any, people came through here. It was perfect. I set up my tent quickly and gathered firewood before the sun dipped too low. The temperature would drop significantly at night, and I didn't want to be scrambling for warmth in the dark. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back against a fallen log, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed, but as night fell, that peace started to feel different. The woods became eerily silent. The usual night sounds, crickets, distant hoots of owls, rustling leaves were absent. It was the kind of silence that made you feel watched. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Being alone in the woods can do that. I tried to shake the feeling and crawled into my tent, zipping it shut. The fire outside still flickered, casting shadows against the fabric of the tent. I lay there for a while, listening. Still nothing. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A single snap, a branch breaking somewhere close. My heart pounded. Could have been anything, a deer, a raccoon. But I didn't hear footsteps, just that one sharp crack. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, but I didn't unzip the tent. Instead, I listened. Nothing followed. No movement, no sound. I convinced myself it was nothing and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to find my firewood scattered. The neat pile I had made was now a mess, some pieces lying several feet away. I frowned, trying to piece together a logical explanation. Maybe an animal had messed with it, but the way it was spread out felt deliberate. I checked my surroundings. My food was still secured in a bag hanging from a tree, untouched. My gear was exactly where I left it. Just the firewood had been disturbed. I pushed the unease aside, ate a quick breakfast, and decided to explore. The woods were thick, the trails barely visible beneath fallen leaves. I kept track of my steps, marking trees with small scratches from my knife to make sure I could find my way back. The deeper I went, the heavier the air felt. It was an odd sensation, like I had wandered into a place I wasn't supposed to be. Then I saw it, a small clearing up ahead, different from the one I camped in. In the center was an old, rusted-out car. It looked like it had been there for years. The windows were shattered, the tires flat and sunken into the earth. Moss grew over the hood, and vines curled through the broken glass. I approached cautiously, circling it. There were no signs of who it had belonged to. No footprints, no remains. Just an abandoned car in the middle of nowhere. My stomach twisted. Who had driven this here? Why had they left it? I backed away, suddenly feeling very aware of how alone I was. The woods no longer felt inviting. They felt wrong. I turned back the way I came, following my marks. I walked faster than before, my senses on high alert. Every sound made me flinch. When I got back to my campsite, the firewood was scattered again. But this time, something else was different. My tent was unzipped. I hadn't left it that way. A cold fear settled in my chest. I stepped closer, heart hammering. My sleeping bag was unrolled. My backpack was open, but nothing was missing. Someone had been in my tent, gone through my things, and left. I spun around, scanning the trees. Whoever had done this was still out there, watching. I made a decision right then. I was leaving. I packed up as fast as I could, shoving everything into my bag without care. The walk back to my truck was the longest I had ever taken. Every rustle, every snapped twig made my skin crawl. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear inside and locked the doors. My hands shook as I started the engine. The drive back felt like a blur, but I didn't breathe easily until I was miles away from those woods. When I got home, I searched online for any stories about that area. Missing hikers, strange encounters, anything that could explain what had happened. I found almost nothing. Just an old article from decades ago about a man who had gone missing in those woods. His car had been found abandoned deep inside, but his body was never recovered. I don't know who was out there that night or what they wanted. I only know one thing for sure. I won't ever go back. I remember the first time I saw the cabin, how the trees stood tall around it, thick and endless, the ground littered with dead leaves and damp earth. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of pine, wet wood, and something stale, like old dust settled into the cracks of forgotten things. The place had been in my family for decades, but no one ever used it anymore. My uncle had been the last one to stay there, and he never talked about it after he left. Just sold it to me cheap, said he was done with the whole idea of the woods. I liked the idea of being alone for a while. No people, no noise, just me and the quiet. I had things to figure out, and I thought the cabin would give me the space to do that. I packed up supplies, enough for weeks, and made the drive upstate, past the smaller towns, until the roads turned into dirt paths. I remember the sound of gravel crunching under the tires, the way the trees seemed to close in as I got closer. It felt like I was stepping into a different world, one that had been waiting for me to return. The cabin was small but solid. A single room with a stove, a bed, and a table with 2 chairs. A separate outhouse stood a few feet away, and there was a small shed filled with tools that had gone untouched for years. Everything smelled old, the kind of old that doesn't go away even when you open the windows. I spent the first day cleaning, shaking out blankets, wiping down counters, trying to make it feel like mine. The silence stretched out around me so thick it felt like it had weight. No hum of traffic, no voices, just the wind pushing through the trees. It was peaceful. At least that's what I told myself. The first few nights, I slept hard, the kind of sleep that comes when you're away from everything. But something changed on the 4th night. I woke up suddenly, with that strange feeling that someone had called my name, though I knew no one was around. The cabin was cold. The fire in the stove had burned low. I pulled the blankets around me and listened. The woods had their own sounds, twigs snapping, wind moving branches. But this was different. It was close, too close, a rustling near the shed, then silence. I told myself it was an animal, probably a raccoon, maybe a fox. I forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I checked outside. The ground was soft from rain, and I noticed something strange near the shed. Footprints. Not boot prints, not paw prints. Bare feet. Human. The sight of them sent a chill through me. They weren't mine. I hadn't been outside barefoot. And they weren't old either. The edges were sharp, undisturbed by wind or rain. Whoever made them had been there last night. Watching. Listening. I locked the door that night. Stoked the fire until the room was warm. Sat in the chair with a knife in my lap, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. The rustling, slow, deliberate. Then the sound of something scraping against wood. The shed door. My stomach tightened. I wanted to tell myself it was the wind, but I knew better. I stayed still, barely breathing. The sound stopped after a few minutes, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked the shed. The door was slightly open. I knew I had shut it before. Inside, things had been moved. An old saw, a hammer, a few nails scattered on the floor. It wasn't much, but it was enough to know someone had been in there. Someone had been watching me. I told myself I'd leave, pack up, and go. But something in me wanted to know, wanted to see. I stayed one more night. That was my mistake. I sat up in bed, listening. The air was still, but I could feel something was wrong. Then a noise, not outside, inside. A slow, deliberate creak of floorboards. My heart pounded. I reached for the knife, gripping it tight. The fire had burned low, throwing shadows against the walls. I stayed still, barely breathing. Then I saw it. The slightest shift in the darkness near the door. A shape, someone standing there, silent, watching me. I didn't think. I moved fast, lunging forward with the knife. The shape ducked back, slamming against the doorframe before bolting outside. I ran after them, bare feet hitting the cold wood of the porch. The moon was out, casting pale light over the trees. I caught a glimpse of them, too fast to see details, just movement, the flash of skin before they disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep that night, didn't turn my back to the door. When morning came, I packed everything, threw it into the truck, and left without looking back. I don't know who they were. I don't know how long they had been watching me before I noticed. Maybe they had been there from the start. Maybe they had been there long before I arrived. All I know is that they were real, and they were close, too close. I never went back to the cabin. I told my uncle to sell it, to burn it, to do whatever he wanted with it. I didn't care. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some silences aren't meant to be broken. I know that now. I never should have taken the job. The ad was vague, just like they always are. It promised good pay for simple work, caretaking an old hunting cabin for a few weeks while the owner was away. The guy on the phone barely gave me any details, just a date, an address, and a promise that everything I needed would be stocked inside. I didn't ask questions. I should have. The place was deep in the woods, miles from any real road. My truck struggled up the narrow dirt path, tires slipping on damp leaves. By the time I saw the cabin, it was nearly dark. It was an old thing, the kind of place that had seen decades of rough winters. Wooden walls dark with age, a sagging roof, a front porch littered with dead leaves. It looked abandoned. The guy had said it would be stocked, but when I went inside, I saw no food, no extra firewood, nothing. Just a bed, a wood stove, a single chair, and a small table with an old lantern on it. The walls had a few hunting trophies nailed up, deer antlers, faded pictures of men with rifles standing over their kills. The first night was uneventful, just me and the silence of the woods. But something felt off. Maybe it was the way the wind barely moved the trees, or the way the house creaked like someone shifting their weight when I lay down to sleep. The second day, I hiked around to get my bearings. The land was empty. No trails, no signs of anyone coming through in a long time. I found an old shed about 50 yards behind the cabin. The lock on the door was rusted, but the inside smelled of old blood and something worse. Animal skins were nailed up to dry, the fur curling at the edges. I told myself it was just hunting remains, but something was wrong with them. Some of the skins weren't deer or anything I could recognize. That night, I heard noises outside. At first, I thought it was just the usual sounds of the forest, branches shifting, leaves rustling. But it wasn't random. It was deliberate, slow footsteps circling the cabin. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was my imagination. But the sound kept going, moving in steady loops around the house. Then it stopped, right outside the door. The handle moved. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the door, waiting. After what felt like hours, the sound moved away, back into the woods. The next morning, I checked outside. No footprints, nothing disturbed, but the door felt wrong, like it had been tested, pushed. I wanted to leave, but the truck wouldn't start. No cell service, of course. I had enough food for a few more days, but after that, I had no plan. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the window watching the woods. Around midnight, I saw movement. Something was out there, not an animal. It was too still, too patient. Then it moved closer. A man, or something shaped like one. His clothes were torn, his face obscured by shadow. He stood at the tree line, just watching. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After a while, he stepped back into the woods. By morning, I was done. I took the rifle from above the fireplace, old but still loaded, and started walking. The truck was useless, but maybe I could hike out. I figured if I followed the road, I'd eventually hit another house or a main road. But I didn't make it far. Less than a mile in, I found something that stopped me cold. A house. No, not a house. Another cabin. Just like mine. Same sagging roof. Same single chair on the porch. Same everything. Like it had been copied and pasted into the woods. But it wasn't abandoned. Smoke curled from the chimney. The door was cracked open. I didn't go inside. I turned around, heart pounding, and walked back the way I came. But when I got back to my cabin, the door was wide open. And inside, the chair, the same chair I'd been sitting in all night, was knocked over. Someone had been inside. I locked the door and didn't sleep. I didn't even sit. I just stood in the corner, holding the rifle, waiting for the sun. At dawn, I left again. This time, I didn't stop walking. I ignored the second cabin. I ignored the sounds behind me, the feeling of eyes watching from the trees. I walked for hours, maybe longer, and then, just as the sun started to set, I saw something through the trees. A road. I ran. I ran harder than I ever have in my life. When I hit the pavement, I almost collapsed. A truck came by not long after. A hunter. He gave me a ride into town. I didn't tell him the full story, just that my truck had broken down, that I needed to get back home. I never called the guy who hired me, never asked for my pay. I just left. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I dream about that other cabin, the one just like mine, and I wonder if, somewhere deep in those woods, someone else is watching a house that looks just like theirs, and waiting. I took the trip alone. It wasn't supposed to be anything extreme, just a quiet weekend at a remote cabin in the woods. I needed a break from the noise of the city, from my job, from everything. The idea of solitude was something I had always enjoyed, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. A small, one-room cabin with a wood-burning stove, an old generator, and nothing but trees for miles. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive there was long and uneventful. As I left the main road and turned onto a dirt path, I felt the shift in atmosphere immediately. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine, and the road ahead was uneven, covered in fallen leaves and loose gravel. My car rocked over the bumps, but it handled the rough terrain well enough. The cabin itself was older than I expected. It was sturdy, but the wood showed signs of age. Dark spots where water had seeped in, rusted nails protruding slightly from the planks. The front door stuck a little when I pushed it open, the hinges letting out a slow, groaning sound. Inside, it was simple. A small kitchenette, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch that sagged in the middle, and a bed pushed against the wall. There was an old wood stove in the corner and a pile of logs stacked neatly beside it. The first night was quiet. I built a fire, made a quick meal, and read a book by lantern light. The generator powered a single bulb in the ceiling, but I liked the dim, flickering glow of the lantern better. Felt more fitting. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in slow, rhythmic gusts. It was peaceful, isolating, but in a good way. The next morning, I decided to explore the woods around the cabin. The trees were dense, their trunks thick and gnarled. The forest floor was soft with moss, and I could hear the sound of birds overhead. I walked for a while, breathing in the crisp air, enjoying the quiet. I didn't wander too far. I knew better than to get lost in an unfamiliar place. After about an hour, I turned back. When I reached the cabin, something felt off. I couldn't pinpoint it at first, but there was a shift, a subtle difference that made my stomach tighten. The door was closed just as I had left it, the windows still locked from the inside. But as I stepped onto the porch, I noticed footprints in the dirt. Not mine. They were slightly smaller, the treads different from my boots. I hesitated, scanning the tree line, but there was no movement. The woods were still, just the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Maybe a hunter had passed through, someone from town. That had to be it. Still, my fingers tightened around the handle of the hatchet I had brought with me. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. The rest of the day passed slowly. I kept an eye on the woods, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the footprints could have been there before and I had only just noticed. By nightfall, I almost believed it. Then, sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound outside, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. I lay still, barely breathing. Another crunch, closer this time. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The fire had burned low, casting only faint shadows along the walls. I reached for the lantern and flicked it on. The sound stopped immediately. The cabin was silent again, the only noise my own ragged breathing. I sat there for a long time listening, waiting, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was an animal, a deer maybe. I forced myself to sleep, but it was restless, my mind replaying the sound over and over. The next morning, I found more footprints. They were fresh, leading from the tree line to the edge of the cabin. They stopped just beneath the window. My window. I packed my things. Felt stupid, overreacting like this, but every instinct I had screamed at me to leave. I loaded my bag into the car, started the engine, and put it in reverse. As I glanced up at the cabin one last time, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A piece of rope, tied in a loop, hanging from a tree branch near the porch. It hadn't been there before. I didn't stay to find out more. I drove, faster than I should have, the road uneven beneath my tires. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, surrounded by other cars, by people. The weight in my chest finally lessened. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was out there watching, waiting, but I know one thing for certain. I wasn't alone. I never should have gone back to that cabin, but at the time I thought it would be peaceful, a good place to clear my head. I had taken a leave of absence from work, and I needed to be alone for a while. No emails, no calls, no noise. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. The cabin had been in my family for years. It sat deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road, the kind of place where no one could find you if you didn't want to be found. The first time I had stayed there alone, I was a kid. My father had taken me hunting, and we spent 3 days in the cold, chopping wood and telling stories by the fire. But this time I was alone, and the forest felt different. The trees seemed taller, the silence heavier. There was no distant hum of traffic, no birds chirping, nothing, just the wind pushing through the trees. I had driven up early in the morning. The road leading to the cabin was barely more than a dirt path, and my truck struggled over the rocks and roots that had grown into the road. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, I sat in the truck for a few minutes, staring at the place. The wood was weathered, the roof sagging slightly. The windows were covered in a thin layer of grime. It looked abandoned, almost forgotten. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and old wood. I opened the windows, letting the crisp autumn air push the mustiness out. I dropped my bag on the table and started unpacking. Canned food, bottled water, a hunting knife, a flashlight. I had enough supplies to last me a week. The first day passed uneventfully. I walked through the woods, took in the quiet, and made a small fire when the sun started setting. The night was cold, but the fire kept the cabin warm. I read a book by lantern light and fell asleep early. Then, in the middle of the night, something woke me. A sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the leaves around the cabin. I held my breath, listening. Then silence. I got out of bed and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't turn it on yet. Instead, I stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. The trees swayed slightly, but I couldn't see anything. No movement, no shapes. I waited a few more minutes, then went back to bed, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. But my gut told me otherwise. I barely slept after that. Every little sound outside kept me awake, my ears straining for anything unusual. The next morning, I stepped outside to check around the cabin. There were tracks in the dirt, human tracks. They circled the cabin once, then led off into the trees. My stomach tightened. I wasn't alone. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I told myself I was being paranoid. The tracks could have been old. Maybe some hunter had passed through days ago. Still, I locked the door when I went inside. That night, the noises came again. Footsteps, closer this time. I lay still in bed, gripping my hunting knife, listening. Then, a soft tapping at the window. Not knocking, just the sound of fingernails scratching against the glass. My chest tightened. My breathing slowed. I didn't move. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one window to the next. Whoever was out there was circling the cabin again. Then silence. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. When the sun came up, I checked outside again. More footprints, fresh ones. They stopped right at my window. My hands shook as I traced the tracks with my eyes. They led back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. I was being watched. That day, I stayed inside, keeping my rifle close. I barely ate. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, staring at me. But I saw nothing, just the empty forest. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair. I didn't know if it would do any good, but it made me feel a little safer. Then I sat by the window, rifle in hand, waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of the doorknob turning. Slowly, quietly, someone was trying to open the door. I gripped the rifle tighter, my heart pounding. The knob turned again, more forcefully this time. Then silence. Whoever it was, they were still there. I knew it. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Then the sound of footsteps again, moving away. The crunch of leaves, getting softer, fading into the night. I stayed awake until dawn. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my bag. I wasn't staying another night. When I opened the door, my stomach dropped. A knife stabbed into the wooden porch. I grabbed my bag, locked the cabin behind me, and left. I didn't run, but I walked fast, my rifle gripped tight in my hands. As I drove away, I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if someone was watching me from the trees. I never went back to that cabin again. I never expected to find myself alone in a remote cabin, deep in the woods, with no cell service and no way to reach the outside world. But that's exactly where I was, and what happened there still keeps me awake at night. It wasn't ghosts, demons, or anything supernatural. It was something much worse, something real. I had planned the trip for months. After weeks of stress from work, I needed a break. No emails, no calls, just me, the woods, and the silence. The idea of staying in a cabin away from the city sounded perfect. I had found the place online. A small, rustic wooden cabin in the middle of nowhere, about a 4-hour drive from the nearest town. The listing described it as secluded and peaceful, perfect for a getaway. That's exactly what I was looking for. I booked it for a week. The drive up was uneventful. The farther I got from civilization, the more the roads narrowed. The last stretch was nothing but a dirt path, winding through thick trees. It was already late afternoon when I arrived. The cabin was small but sturdy looking, with a steep roof and a wraparound porch. There was no electricity, just an old generator out back and no running water, only a well with a manual pump. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. A fireplace stood in one corner, and a single bed with a thick wool blanket was pushed against the wall. A small kitchenette with a propane stove and a battered wooden table completed the place. I unpacked my supplies: canned food, bottled water, a flashlight, and my hunting knife, just in case. I planned to spend my days hiking and my nights reading by lantern light. That first night was peaceful. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I fell asleep quickly. The second night was when things started to feel wrong. It began with a noise, a faint rustling outside. At first, I ignored it. There were plenty of animals in the woods, raccoons, deer, maybe a fox. But then it happened again. A distinct crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I sat up in bed, listening. Nothing. The wind had picked up, making the trees creak. I told myself it was just an animal and tried to go back to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was soft from recent rain, making it easy to spot tracks. I expected to find deer prints. Instead, I found something else: footprints. Bare footprints. Human. They were fresh, leading from the tree limb to the cabin's porch, then back into the woods. My stomach twisted. No one else was supposed to be out here. The nearest cabin was miles away. I stood there, staring at the prints, my breath clouding in the cold morning air. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe another hiker got lost? Maybe some local wandered too far from home? But then why approach the cabin and leave without knocking? I spent the rest of the day on edge. I tried to enjoy my hike, but every snap of a twig had me turning my head. I returned to the cabin before dark, locked the door, and kept my knife close. That night, the noises returned. The same rustling, the same crunching. But this time, it didn't stop. It circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps. I held my breath, gripping my knife so hard my knuckles turned white. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Then something tapped against the window. A single, sharp tap. Then another. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The tapping stopped. A long silence followed. Then, the footsteps retreated, vanishing into the woods. I barely slept. The first light, I checked outside. The footprints were back. Closer this time, right up to the window. I packed my bags, ready to leave. But when I tried to start my car, nothing happened. The engine wouldn't turn over. I checked under the hood, but I didn't know what I was looking for. The battery was fine. Nothing seemed broken, but the car was dead. Panic set in. I was stranded. No phone service, no car, and someone, somewhere was watching me. I spent the day trying to fix the engine, but I had no tools and no real knowledge of cars. As the sun set, I knew I had no choice but to spend another night in the cabin. I barricaded the door with the table, stacked logs in the fireplace, and kept my knife within reach. I sat in the chair by the fire, watching the flickering light. Hours passed. Then, just past midnight, I heard it, the sound of my car door opening. A cold wave of terror washed over me. I hadn't locked it. I hadn't thought I needed to. Then the trunk. A slow creak as it opened. I wanted to move, to look outside, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't listen. A few minutes passed. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn, my knife clutched in my hand. When the first light crept through the trees, I forced myself outside. My car doors were shut, but something was wrong. The back seat was empty, but my bags had been rummaged through. My food was gone. My water, too, but nothing else. My keys still in the ignition. The engine still wouldn't start. I had no choice but to walk. I packed what little I had left, slung my bag over my shoulder, and set out. The hike to the main road was at least 15 miles. I didn't look back. I walked for hours, my legs aching, my breath ragged. The forest was silent, too silent. I felt watched, like something was moving just beyond my vision, keeping pace with me. I pushed forward. By the time I reached the road, the sun was setting. My legs were numb, my feet blistered. I kept walking, following the road, hoping for a passing car. After what felt like an eternity, one appeared in the distance. I waved it down, nearly collapsing as the driver stopped. He was a local, an older man with a weathered face. He didn't ask many questions, just gave me a ride into town. At the police station, I told them everything. They sent a deputy out to check the cabin. When they returned, they found my car exactly as I'd left it. But there was something else. Footprints, dozens of them, surrounding the cabin, leading into the woods. Some were old, some fresh, and some were smaller, child-sized. They never found who it was. I never went back. Even now, in the safety of my home, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, out there, someone is still watching, waiting, and that they know exactly where to find me. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would rent a cabin alone in the woods, but there I was. I had been working long hours at my job, drowning in stress, and I needed a break from everything. Phones, emails, people. I wanted solitude, so I found a remote cabin through a rental site. It was far from the nearest town, surrounded by thick trees, with no cell service. That was exactly what I wanted. A week of complete isolation. The drive took longer than expected. The roads got narrower the deeper I went into the woods, twisting through dense forest. I hadn't seen another car for at least an hour when I finally spotted the turnoff. A narrow dirt path led me to the cabin, a small, weathered structure sitting alone in a clearing. It had a porch, a single chimney, and a small shed off to the side. The sun was starting to set behind the trees when I parked the car and stepped out. I went inside and looked around. It was simple. A living room with an old couch and a fireplace, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a bedroom with a creaky wooden bed. It smelled like old wood and dust, but it was clean enough. The rental listing had mentioned a generator since there was no power out here. I found it behind the cabin, cranked it on, and the lights flickered to life. The hum of the generator filled the silence of the woods. I unpacked my things, made a quick meal, and settled in for the night. I felt good about my decision. The stillness was calming, and I let myself relax for the first time in months. But by the second night, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small things that didn't seem right. The first thing I noticed was the door to the shed. When I arrived, the shed door had been slightly open. I remembered closing it when I went out to check the generator. But the next morning, it was open again, just a crack. I figured maybe the wind had pushed it open, even though there hadn't been much wind. I shut it again and moved on. Later that day, I went for a short walk around the property. The forest was thick, but there were faint trails leading deeper into the woods. The further I walked, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. It was unsettling. That night, I woke up to a sound outside. It was faint, like footsteps crunching on leaves. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, but something about it didn't feel right. I stayed awake for a long time before finally drifting back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human footprints in the dirt, leading from the woods to the cabin. They stopped right at my front door. My first thought was that maybe someone had come to check on me, but that didn't make sense. The rental owner had told me no one else would be around. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't ignore the creeping feeling in my gut. I checked around the cabin. Nothing was missing. The shed door was closed this time, but when I looked inside, I noticed something odd. A dusty old axe was missing from the wall. There had been a spot where tools were hanging, and I could see the outline where the axe had once been. I searched the area but didn't find it. Maybe the owner had taken it, I told myself, though I didn't fully believe it. By the fourth day, I was on edge. I kept hearing faint noises at night, soft scraping sounds near the walls, twigs snapping in the distance. I locked the doors and windows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, as I sat in the living room, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving outside. I turned off the lights and peeked through the window. Nothing. The woods were pitch black. The generator hummed in the background, masking any small noises. I stood there for a long time, staring out into the darkness, waiting for something to move. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, motionless, just standing there watching the cabin. My stomach twisted into knots. It was too dark to see any details, but I knew it wasn't my imagination. Someone was out there. They didn't move. They just stood there. I couldn't tell if they were facing me, but I felt their gaze locked onto me. I backed away from the window, heart pounding. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a fireplace poker, and moved toward the bedroom, locking myself inside. I barely slept that night. Every sound made me jump. I waited for the morning, counting down the hours until daylight. When the sun finally came up, I cautiously stepped outside. The figure was gone, but the footprints remained. They led from the tree line to the side of the cabin, stopping just beneath my bedroom window. Someone had been standing there, right outside while I was inside, listening, waiting. I decided I had enough. I packed my things in record time and got ready to leave. But when I went to start my car, my stomach dropped. The hood was open. Someone had tampered with the engine. Wires were cut, and the battery was missing. I was stranded. Panic set in. I had no way to call for help, no way to drive out. The nearest town was miles away, and I had no idea if the person or people who had been outside my cabin were still watching me. I had to think fast. I remembered the generator. It had a small gas supply. I grabbed a can from the shed and took off on foot. I had seen a ranger station on the way in about 5 miles down the road. If I could make it there, I could call for help. I moved quickly, checking over my shoulder constantly. The woods felt suffocating. Every sound made my skin crawl. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs aching, the canister feeling heavier with each step. Then I saw it, the ranger station up ahead. But something was wrong. The door was wide open. The inside was dark. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back. But I needed help. I stepped inside. The place had been trashed. Papers scattered, chairs overturned. And then, on the wall, scratched into the wood, I saw a message. "They watch from the trees." I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the road. The sun was setting, and I knew I couldn't be caught outside after dark. Then, in the distance, I saw headlights. A truck. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms. The truck slowed. A man rolled down his window. "You okay?" I barely got the words out. "Someone's out here. They, my car, ranger station." He nodded. "Get in." I didn't hesitate. I climbed in and we drove off. I glanced back once, just as we rounded a bend, and I saw them. Several figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching, unmoving. Dozens of them. I never looked back again. I never went back to that cabin. And I never, ever went into the woods alone again. I woke up to the sound of something scratching against wood. It wasn't a dream, I was sure of that. The noise was real, coming from outside the cabin. At first, I thought it might be an animal. The woods around my cabin were full of raccoons, deer, even the occasional bear. But something about the sound didn't sit right with me. It was too slow, too deliberate, like someone dragging their nails across the wooden walls. I held my breath and listened. The scratching stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and heavy. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the wind or some stray branch brushing against the cabin. But then it started again, this time on the window. A long, slow scrape against the glass. I stayed completely still in bed, barely breathing. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The window was right next to me, covered only by thin curtains that did nothing to block out the outside. If I moved too much, whoever or whatever was out there might notice. The scratching continued for what felt like forever, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was doing it was trying to get my attention. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening. Nothing, just the sound of the wind in the trees, the distant call of some night bird. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I forced myself to check the window. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the glass. Long, jagged scratch marks ran across the surface, deep enough that I could feel them when I ran my fingers over them. My stomach twisted. I stepped outside and checked the wooden walls of the cabin. More scratches. Some were light, just surface marks, but others were deep, gouging into the wood like something sharp had been dragged across it. I told myself it had to be an animal. A bear, maybe, though I'd never seen one act like that before. I checked for tracks, but found nothing. The ground was dry, covered in a layer of dead leaves, making it impossible to tell if anything had been there. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the unease. I chopped wood, checked my food supplies, and kept myself busy. But every time I looked at those scratches, I felt a cold pit of dread settle in my stomach. Something wasn't right. That night, I locked every door and window. I even pushed a heavy chair in front of the door, just in case. I told myself it was over. Whatever had been out there was gone. I was wrong. Sometime past midnight, I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not mine. It was deep, slow, and too close. My whole body went rigid. The breathing was right outside the window. I could hear it through the thin glass, steady and deliberate, like someone standing inches away. I didn't move, didn't even blink. The The breathing continued, unhurried. Then a soft tap against the glass. Just once. Then another. And another. Tap, tap, tap. Like someone testing the glass, seeing if it would break. I couldn't move. My body refused to respond. The tapping continued, slow and patient. And then, just as suddenly as before, it stopped. I lay awake the rest of the night, eyes locked on the window, waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning finally came, I went outside to check. The scratches were still there, but this time there were footprints beneath the window. Not animal prints, human, barefoot, deep in the dirt. Someone had been standing there for hours, watching me sleep. I felt sick. My cabin was miles away from the nearest road, deep in the woods. No one came out here. No one should have been out here. I packed my things, deciding I needed to leave. But as I threw my bag over my shoulder, something caught my eye. A piece of fabric, snagged on a nail by the window. It was old, dirty, but definitely from a piece of clothing. Someone had been out here. Someone had been watching me. I locked up the cabin and hiked back to my truck, parked a mile away down a dirt road. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig made my skin crawl. When I finally reached my truck, I almost cried in relief. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time, and that's when I saw him, a man, standing at the edge of the trees, barefoot, watching me drive away. I never went back to that cabin. I had been driving for hours, longer than I should have, but I wanted to put some distance between myself and the city before nightfall. I had rented a cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, just outside a place barely mentioned on a map. It seemed perfect, isolated, quiet, a place where no one would bother me. That was exactly what I needed. The last stretch of the drive was rough. The paved road ended, and the rest was nothing more than a dirt path barely wide enough for my truck. Trees crowded in from both sides, their twisted branches reaching overhead, blocking out what little light remained in the sky. My headlights caught the occasional reflection of an animal's eyes in the darkness, but otherwise, the road was empty. I kept going, my tires crunching against gravel and dried leaves until I finally saw the cabin at the end of the path. It was smaller than I had expected, but that didn't matter. It had 4 walls, a roof, and a door that locked. That was all I needed. The exterior was old but sturdy, built from thick logs that had darkened with age. There was a single window facing the front, its glass reflecting the trees behind me. A wooden porch wrapped around one side, leading to the entrance. There were no signs of life, no tire tracks, no footprints in the dirt. Just silence and the weight of the forest pressing in around me. I parked beside the cabin and cut the engine. The sudden quiet was unnerving, a sharp contrast to the hours of background noise I had grown used to on the drive. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity. Just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional chirp of an insect. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and stepped out, my boots sinking into the damp earth. The air smelled of pine and decaying leaves, heavy and still. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single room with a bed pushed against one wall, a small wood-burning stove in the corner, and a table with 2 chairs. A doorway led to a tiny bathroom with an old, stained sink and a toilet that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The only light came from an oil lamp sitting on the table, its glass cloudy with soot. I set my bag down and turned the lamp's knob, watching as the small flame flickered to life. There was no electricity, no running water, just the bare essentials. That was fine. I had prepared for this. I had enough food and water to last a week, and I wasn't here for comfort. I was here to be alone, to think, to get away from everything. I had spent too long in places where people always needed something from me, where I was constantly surrounded by noise. This was my escape. I locked the door behind me and checked the windows, making sure they were secure. Then, I sat at the table, eating a meal from a can, listening to the sounds of the woods outside. The wind picked up, making the trees groan and creak. Something scurried across the roof, its tiny claws scratching against the wood. Probably a squirrel, maybe a raccoon. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was safe here. But then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper against the wind. A rustling in the leaves, the snap of a twig, then a heavy footstep, slow, deliberate, close. I froze, my spoon halfway to my mouth. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I strained to listen, but the wind made it impossible to tell where the sound had come from. Another step, closer now, just outside the window. I turned my head slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the glass. Nothing, just trees and shadows. But I knew I had heard something. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor. I moved toward the window, careful not to make a sound. My breath felt too loud in my chest. I reached out, pressed my fingers against the glass, and peered outside. Nothing, just trees, just darkness. Then the sound came again. Not outside, inside. Behind me, I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. The cabin was empty. The door was still locked. The windows were shut, but something had moved. I was sure of it. I grabbed the oil lamp, lifting it higher, casting flickering shadows across the walls. My bag sat where I had left it. The bed was untouched. The bathroom door stood open, revealing the small, empty space inside. I wasn't alone. The feeling was overwhelming, a deep, primal instinct screaming at me. I turned in slow circles, searching for anything out of place. I checked under the bed, inside the tiny closet, behind the stove. Nothing. Then why did I still feel like I was being watched? The wind howled outside, shaking the walls. I forced myself to take a deep breath. Maybe I was just on edge. Maybe the isolation was already getting to me. I had spent too long surrounded by people, by constant noise. Now, in the silence, my mind was playing tricks on me. I sat back down, forcing myself to eat, to focus on something other than the feeling crawling up my spine. The sound didn't come again, but the feeling never left. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me sit up, my ears straining in the darkness. I kept the lamp burning low, afraid of what I might see if I let the cabin go completely dark. My knife rested on the table beside me, within reach, just in case. Morning came slowly. The first light crept through the trees, pushing back the shadows. The unease from the night before still clung to me, but I told myself it was just nerves. I had wanted isolation. I had gotten it, but I wasn't alone. The next few days were worse. The feeling never left. I would hear things moving outside at night, too heavy to be an animal, too slow to be the wind. Footsteps circled the cabin, stopping just beneath the windows. I never saw anything, never found any tracks, but I knew something or someone was out there. By the fourth night, I had had enough. I packed my things, loaded my truck, and started down the narrow dirt road. The trees pressed in around me, their shadows long in the fading light. Then, in my rearview mirror, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, too far to make out a face, but close enough to know it was watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just drove, faster than I should have, pushing my truck harder than was safe. I didn't breathe properly until I hit the main road, until the trees thinned and the sky opened up above me. I never went back. I never told anyone. But sometimes, in the quiet moments of the night, I still feel it. That presence, watching. I never liked the idea of spending time alone in the woods. I wasn't the kind of person who romanticized cabins, campfires, or the silence of nature. But when my friend Mark offered me his family's remote hunting cabin for the weekend, I took it. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to. Life in the city had become suffocating. Work stress, a breakup, and just the general noise of it all. I thought a weekend away from everything might help clear my head. The drive up took longer than expected. The directions Mark gave me were clear, but the roads were rough, unpaved dirt trails that seemed barely used. My tires kicked up dust that clung to my windows. I lost cell service miles before I reached the cabin. When I finally pulled up, I wasn't impressed. The cabin was small, old, and clearly neglected. The wooden structure was gray with age, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were dusty, the front steps were warped, and the door had deep scratches on it. I told myself it was probably just from an animal. Inside, it was no better. The place smelled like damp wood and dust. A small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a living space with a stone fireplace. A thick layer of dust covered the furniture. There was no electricity, just a few oil lamps. Water came from a well outside, and the toilet was an outhouse behind the cabin. I wasn't planning to stay long, just 2 nights. I dropped my bag on the creaky bed, set up my sleeping bag, and went to gather firewood before it got dark. The forest was dense, the trees packed tightly together. As I walked, the silence became overwhelming. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling leaves, just my own footsteps. The stillness felt unnatural. I tried to ignore it, focused on collecting wood. When I turned back toward the cabin, I had the distinct feeling that someone was watching me. By the time I got back, the sun was setting. I lit a fire in the fireplace and heated up a can of soup. As I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't paranoia, it was something deeper. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see something looking in. But there was nothing. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easy. The bed was stiff, and the blankets smelled musty. The wind picked up outside, making the old wood creak. Then I heard something else. A sound I couldn't immediately place. It was distant at first, but it got closer. A steady, rhythmic crunching. Footsteps on the dry leaves outside. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the cabin. Then scratching. Slow, deliberate. It moved along the side of the cabin, dragging across the wood. My heart pounded. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't move like that, don't scrape their claws or whatever it was so methodically. I reached for my flashlight, but I hesitated before turning it on. If there was something or someone out there, I didn't want them to know I was awake. I gripped the flashlight tightly, listening. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, just as I was beginning to relax, the doorknob rattled. I sat up straight, heart hammering. The rattling was slow at first, then more forceful. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, listening, waiting. Finally, I convinced myself that whatever it was gone. I forced myself to lie back down, though sleep never came. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The moment the sun rose, I stepped outside. There were footprints in the dirt, large human footprints. They led from the forest to my door, then around the cabin, disappearing into the trees. I told myself it was just some local messing with me, but deep down, I knew better. The tracks didn't lead from anywhere, just from the trees, as if whoever made them had been standing there, waiting, watching. I wanted to leave, but I forced myself to stay. It was broad daylight, and I didn't want to let my fear get the better of me. I spent the day chopping wood, keeping busy, but every so often I would stop and listen. The woods were too quiet. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and kept my flashlight in hand. I lay in bed, waiting. Around midnight, I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time, they didn't stop at the cabin. They circled. Slow, steady. I gripped the flashlight so hard my hand ached. Then, a new sound. Tapping on the window. A single, deliberate tap. Then another. I couldn't move. My entire body locked up. The tapping moved to the other window. Then the next. Then the doorknob. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. My heart slammed against my ribs. Then I heard something worse than all of it. A whisper. Low, barely audible, just outside the door. It was my name. I don't know how long it lasted. The whispering, the footsteps, the tapping. Felt like hours. But eventually it stopped. At first light, I grabbed my bag, got in my car, and drove. I didn't look back. When I finally got back to town and told Mark, he looked pale. He told me something I didn't want to hear. His family had stopped using that cabin years ago because his uncle had gone missing there. They had searched for days, but he was never found. The only thing they did find was his truck, still parked outside, and a set of footprints leading into the woods. And in the dirt near the cabin, his name scratched into the wood of the door. I never went back. I never will. I took the cabin because I needed to get away. Life had been too much lately, work, the city, the constant noise. I told myself I needed a break, somewhere quiet, somewhere remote. The cabin was a last-minute find, deep in the woods, far from anything that could remind me of my daily life. The pictures online showed a simple wooden structure, a fireplace, a lake nearby. It looked perfect. The drive out was long. The roads narrowed, the trees thickened, and eventually, I found myself on a dirt path that wound through dense forest. The cabin was isolated, exactly what I wanted. No neighbors, no traffic, no streetlights, just trees, wind, and silence. I arrived in the afternoon, the sun low but still warm. The cabin was smaller than it looked in pictures, but that was fine. One room with a bed against the wall, a fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a bathroom with a rust-stained sink. The wood smelled old, like damp earth and time. I dropped my bags, walked outside, and took a deep breath. The air was thick with pine and the scent of the lake. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. I spent the rest of the evening settling in. I lit a fire, made a simple meal, sat by the window and watched the sky darken. The forest was alive with sounds, branches shifting, something moving through the undergrowth, the distant call of an owl. It was peaceful. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. That night, I woke up to a noise, a thump, not far outside the cabin. I lay still, heart hammering. Another thump, then silence. The fire had burned low, shadows flickering across the wooden walls. I strained to hear, but nothing else came. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe. Something harmless. I pulled the blanket tighter and forced myself back to sleep. Morning came with an eerie quiet. The usual sounds of the forest seemed muted. I stepped outside, stretching, and noticed something strange. The dirt outside the cabin had been disturbed. Tracks. Not deep enough for boots, not quite the right shape for animal prints either. Just indentations, like something heavy had been pressed into the earth. I felt uneasy but told myself it was nothing. I had come here to relax, not to let my mind play tricks on me. The day passed in quiet routine. I explored the area a little, walked down to the lake, skipped stones across the surface. The water was still, reflecting the sky in perfect clarity. There were no other cabins, no boats, no people. Just me and the trees and the vast stretch of water. That night, the noises came again. This time, they were closer. A soft scrape against the wood of the cabin. Then another. My breath caught. I lay frozen, listening. The sound moved, slow, deliberate. Something outside, circling. I clenched my fists, waiting. Then silence. I forced myself to stay still, to breathe. It had to be an animal. A raccoon, maybe. Nothing dangerous. Still, I barely slept. By morning, I was exhausted. I stepped outside and my stomach dropped. More tracks. This time, clearer. They weren't animal prints. They weren't boot prints. They were just marks. Shapes pressed into the dirt, leading from the trees, stopping right outside my window. Then gone, as if whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. I told myself to leave. My gut screamed at me to go. But I had paid for the week. I had driven all the way out here, and I didn't want to be the kind of person who's scared easily. So I stayed. That night, the noises came earlier. A soft drag against the door. A faint creak of wood. I gripped the blanket, heart pounding. I had locked the door. I had checked it twice. But the sound didn't stop. It was inside the walls now, like something shifting just beneath the surface. My hands shook. I wanted to move, to grab something, anything, but I couldn't. Then it stopped. Silence. The cabin felt too small, too dark. My mind ran through every possibility, but nothing made sense. The next day, I packed my things. I told myself I was being irrational, that I was overthinking, but my body knew better. I needed to leave. I loaded my bags, stepped outside, and froze. The tracks weren't just at my window now. They were everywhere. The ground was covered in them, overlapping, crisscrossing, leading from the woods around the cabin back again. I didn't think. I just ran to my car, threw my bags inside, and started the engine. The tires spun in the dirt before catching. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin sat in the clearing, small, empty, but something was in the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. A shape, still watching. I didn't slow down. I didn't look again. The drive back felt longer. The forest stretched on, the road winding endlessly. When I finally saw the first signs of town, my body unclenched. I checked into a motel, locked the door, and sat awake until sunrise. I never went back. I never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear it. The sound of something dragging against wood, slow and deliberate, and I wonder how close it really got. I never wanted to be up here alone. The idea of a weekend away in the mountains sounded good at first, but by the time I made it up the winding road to the old cabin, I regretted every decision that had led me here. The cabin belonged to my uncle, a man I hadn't seen in years. He'd left it to me after he died. I wasn't particularly close to him, but free property is free property, and I thought maybe I could fix it up, rent it out, or even sell it for a good profit. I didn't know what condition it was in. I had never been up here before. I figured I'd spend a few days taking inventory of what needed to be done. Maybe clear out some of his old things, then head back home before the loneliness got to me. Getting there was already a hassle. The road was barely a road, more like a dirt path that had been carved out years ago and forgotten. My truck's tires kicked up dust and loose gravel as I drove, the occasional pothole making me grip the wheel tighter. The sun had started to dip below the tree line by the time I arrived, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin sat. It was smaller than I expected, a simple one-story structure made of old, darkened wood. The windows were covered in grime, and the front porch sagged slightly in the middle. It was obvious no one had been here in years. The air was cool and the scent of pine was thick, but there was something else, too. Something that made me uneasy. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was the way the trees seemed too close, almost as if they had grown toward the cabin instead of around it. I pushed the front door open, and it creaked loudly, protesting after years of disuse. Inside, dust coated everything. A small kitchen sat to the left, barely big enough for one person. A fireplace with a few logs stacked beside it was against the far wall. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. That was it. I set my bag down and walked through the space, checking the cabinets and drawers. Most were empty, except for a few rusted tools and an old can opener. The bedroom was just a mattress on a frame, the sheets stiff with age. The bathroom had a cracked mirror and a sink that barely dripped when I turned the faucet. The place was old, but it wasn't unlivable. With a little work, I could make something of it. I spent the next few hours cleaning as best I could, wiping down surfaces, shaking out dust-covered sheets, and sweeping the floor. I found an old lantern in a cabinet and lit it, casting a flickering glow around the room. There was no electricity, so I relied on my phone's flashlight when I needed extra light. By the time I was done, it was fully dark outside. The only sound was the wind through the trees, a low whisper that never seemed to stop. I wasn't hungry, but I forced myself to eat a granola bar before lying down on the musty mattress. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside made me tense. I reminded myself that I was alone. There was nothing out there. But then I heard it, a single, deliberate footstep outside. I held my breath. My mind raced. Could be an animal, a deer, maybe even a bear. But the sound had been too distinct, too heavy. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The lantern on the nightstand flickered slightly, casting shadows along the walls. I reached for my phone, careful not to make a sound, and turned on the flashlight. I moved toward the window, keeping my steps light. The glass was streaked with dirt, but I could still see out into the yard. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I exhaled, letting myself relax. Then, another sound, this time from inside the cabin. It was faint, a soft scrape, like something dragging against wood. My blood turned to ice. I turned, scanning the room with my flashlight. The door to the hallway was open, just as I had left it. But something felt different. The air seemed heavier. I took a cautious step forward, my socked feet silent against the wooden floor. The scraping sound came again, closer this time. My eyes darted toward the kitchen. The cabinet door under the sink was open. I was sure it had been closed before. I swallowed hard. There was no way someone had gotten in. I had locked the door. The windows were shut. Still, I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a rusted fire poker leaning against the wall. I held it tight, moving slowly toward the open cabinet. My breath came in shallow gasps. I crouched, flashlight aimed into the darkness of the space beneath the sink. Empty. I let out a shaky breath. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. Maybe I had just forgotten to close it. I turned, ready to go back to bed. And then I saw them. Footprints. Wet, muddy footprints leading from the doorway to where I stood. My stomach dropped. I hadn't heard the door open, hadn't heard anyone come inside. But the prints were there, leading straight to me, and there was one more step. A single, fresh footprint right between mine. I ran, out the door, into the cold night, my breath coming in gasps. I didn't stop to grab anything. I didn't look back. I sprinted to my truck, yanked the door open, and locked it behind me. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition, my foot slamming the pedal. The tires spun on the dirt, then caught, propelling me forward. I didn't stop until I reached town. I never went back to that cabin. I put it up for sale, never even went to collect my things. I didn't care about the money. I didn't care about fixing it up, because someone had been in there with me, and they had been close enough to touch me. I don't know how long they had been there. I don't know how they got in, but I know one thing: they never left. I had been driving for hours, heading deep into the thick woods of northern Montana. The road turned from paved to gravel, then to a narrow dirt path lined with trees so dense they swallowed the last bits of sunlight. The rental car's tires crunched over loose stones as I pushed forward, following the GPS instructions to the isolated cabin I had booked for the week. The idea was simple: get away from everything. No distractions, no people, just me and the quiet. I needed the break. Life in the city had worn me down, and the thought of a week with no emails, no traffic, and no stress seemed perfect. The listing had described the cabin as off-grid but fully stocked. There was a generator for power, a wood stove for heat, and a small stream nearby for water. It was remote, but that was part of the appeal. I had imagined spending my days hiking, chopping wood, maybe even fishing. Nights would be spent reading by the fire, sipping whiskey, enjoying the silence. By the time I arrived, the sun was gone, leaving behind only a dim glow in the sky. The cabin sat in a small clearing, a squat structure made of dark logs, a metal chimney rising from its roof, a wooden porch wrapped around the front, its planks old and slightly warped. There were no neighboring houses, no signs of life except for the occasional rustling in the trees. The GPS lost signal a while back, leaving me completely cut off. I grabbed my bag, stepped onto the porch, and unlocked the door. Inside, the air smelled of aged wood and dust, a slightly damp scent lingering from the last rainfall. The single-room cabin was simple: bed in one corner, a fireplace in the other, a small kitchen against the far wall. A wooden table and 2 chairs sat near the window, and a single oil lamp rested on the counter. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, just silence. Felt peaceful. I spent the first hour settling in, unpacking my food, stacking some logs by the stove. I started a fire, the warmth spreading quickly through the small space. Everything felt just as I had hoped: calm, quiet. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the wind whispering through the trees. But as I sat there, something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a nagging feeling, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I chalked it up to city paranoia and ignored it. I had spent too many years surrounded by people, and maybe my brain just wasn't used to this kind of isolation. That night, I lay in bed listening to the wind. I had expected complete silence, but the forest was alive with noise. Branches swaying, distant animal calls, the occasional snap of a twig. I reminded myself that I was in the woods, miles away from civilization. It was normal. I forced myself to relax, eventually drifting off. I woke to a noise. Not the wind, not an animal. Something else. A slow, deliberate creaking, like someone stepping onto the porch. I held my breath, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak orange light across the room. The creaking stopped. I sat up, heart pounding. I told myself it was just the wood shifting, the cabin adjusting to the temperature change. I stayed still for what felt like hours, waiting for another sound, but there was nothing. Eventually, I lay back down and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I went outside. The porch was empty, no footprints in the dirt, nothing out of place. It had to have been my imagination. Still, the unease stayed with me. I spent the day chopping wood, trying to shake the feeling. The physical labor helped, the repetitive motion clearing my mind. But as the sun began to set, the unease returned. That night, I locked the door and checked the windows twice. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the cabin groan. I sat by the fire with a book, but my eyes kept drifting to the window, scanning the darkness outside. Then I heard it again, a creak on the porch. My stomach tightened. I set my book down slowly, barely breathing. The sound came again, another step. Someone was out there. I reached for the hatchet I had brought inside, gripping the handle with sweating hands. The fire crackled, masking any other noises. I waited, heart hammering. Minutes passed. Nothing. I forced myself to move. Slowly, I crept toward the window. The glass was fogged from the warmth inside, but I could still make out the porch. Empty. The steps leading down into the trees were barely visible in the darkness. If someone had been there, they were gone now. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something, soft rustling, faint snapping of twigs. The woods were alive, but it felt wrong, like something was watching. The next morning, I made a decision. I packed my things, ready to leave. This was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stepped outside, locking the cabin behind me, and made my way to the car. That's when I saw them. Footprints, not mine. They led from the trees to the porch and then away again, disappearing into the dense woods. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been out here, watching. I didn't hesitate. I threw my bag into the car and started the engine. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. It sat there, quiet, unchanged. But I knew I had made the right decision. Whatever had been watching me, whoever had been there at night, they weren't planning on stopping. I drove away, leaving the cabin behind, knowing I would never come back. I had never been the type of person to run away from my problems, but at that point in my life, I needed to get away. My job had drained me. My personal life was a mess, and I had been waking up every day with a headache that felt like it was crushing my skull. The stress was unbearable, and I figured some time alone in a quiet place would help clear my head. I found a listing for a cabin deep in the woods, about 3 hours away from the city. It was cheap, probably because it wasn't some luxury getaway. It was isolated, no running water, and the description made it clear that if you needed help, you'd be on your own. That was fine by me. I wasn't looking for comfort. I just wanted silence, fresh air, and to be away from everything. The drive there was long and uneventful. Once I left the highway, it was just miles and miles of thick forest on either side. The road narrowed until it was barely wide enough for my car. After a while, the trees grew so close together that they blocked out most of the sky, making it feel like I was driving into a tunnel. I kept checking my phone's GPS, but the signal had dropped at some point, leaving me to rely on the directions I had written down. The cabin appeared suddenly at the end of the dirt road. It was smaller than I expected, barely more than a single room with a slanted roof. The wood was aged, gray from years of exposure. There was a fire pit outside, a pile of logs stacked neatly beside it, and a small outhouse about 20 feet away. A single window faced the front, dark and empty. It looked abandoned, but the key was exactly where the owner said it would be, under a loose stone near the door. Inside, the air was stale. Dust clung to every surface, and the floor creaked under my weight. There was a cot pushed against one wall, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and a tiny table with a single chair. I set my bag down and checked my phone. No signal. I expected that, but it still made me uneasy. I spent the first couple of hours settling in. I swept the floor, wiped down the surfaces, and opened the window to let some fresh air in. The silence was overwhelming. I could hear nothing but my own movements and the occasional rustling of leaves outside. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity, just emptiness. It was peaceful in a way, but it also made me feel exposed. As the sun started to set, I went outside to gather firewood. The temperature had dropped, and the woods felt different in the fading light. I tried not to let it get to me, but something about being so far from civilization started to gnaw at the back of my mind. Still, I pushed the feeling aside and focused on the fire. I had brought enough food for a few days, cans of soup, some protein bars, and bottled water. Simple, easy, and nothing that needed refrigeration. The first night was uneventful. I listened to the crackling fire and stared up at the ceiling, my mind drifting. I had expected my thoughts to race, but instead, there was only emptiness, a dull, heavy exhaustion that kept me from thinking too much. I fell asleep quickly. It was sometime in the middle of the night when I woke up, and I had no idea why. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Then I heard it, something moving outside. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, slow, and close. I held my breath and strained to hear more. There was a shuffling sound, the soft crunch of leaves, then nothing. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was watching me. I stayed awake for hours listening, but the sound didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off again. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked around the cabin. There were no signs of anything unusual, no footprints, no disturbances. The forest was still and quiet. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, that my mind had turned normal forest noises into something sinister, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I spent the day hiking around the area, trying to push the paranoia away. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead, their trunks thick and gnarled. I followed a narrow deer trail for a while, but eventually, I lost track of it and had to rely on my sense of direction to get back. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was dipping low, and the air had turned cold again. That night, I made sure the fire was strong before I lay down. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the best of me. But once again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time, there was no slow shuffling. There was a clear, distinct sound. A knock. 3 soft, deliberate knocks against the cabin wall. I froze. My breathing was shallow, my body rigid. I listened, waiting. The silence stretched on. Then another knock, this time closer to the door. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, pointing it at the window. The light reflected off the glass, showing nothing but my own pale face staring back. I sat up, heart hammering, gripping the flashlight so tightly my fingers ached. I waited. The knocking didn't come again. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I checked around the cabin again. Still no signs of anything, but the feeling of being watched was worse. It was like an invisible weight pressing down on me. I knew I needed to leave. Whatever sense of peace I had hoped to find here was gone. I packed my things quickly, threw them into my car, and started the engine. But when I looked up at the tree line, I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the trees, motionless. Too far to see clearly, but close enough that I knew it was watching me. My stomach dropped. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there. I threw the car into reverse and sped down the dirt road, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway, surrounded by the familiar signs of civilization. I never found out who or what was out there. Maybe it was a hunter, maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I will never go back. I had no reason to be out there alone. That thought ran through my head over and over again as I sat in the small wooden cabin, listening to the wind press against the walls, making the old wooden beams groan like a tired animal. It was supposed to be a getaway, a break from the city, from my job, from people. I had rented this place because it was cheap, remote, and didn't come with the distractions of Wi-Fi or cell service. That had sounded perfect at the time. Now, sitting here in the dim light of an old oil lamp, it felt like a mistake. A bad one. The drive up had already been a warning. The road was long and winding, cutting through thick trees that felt like they were closing in the further I went. The dirt path leading to the cabin had barely looked like a road at all, just a gap in the trees. I had to drive slow, the tires slipping in the soft mud left behind by the recent rain. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I had a bad feeling in my stomach. It was small, just a single story with a slanted tin roof and a porch that looked ready to collapse under its own weight. The windows were old, the glass wavy and dirty. The whole place looked forgotten. Inside wasn't much better. The air was thick with dust. The wooden floorboards had deep scratches, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The main room had a small table with 2 chairs, a couch that smelled damp, and a fireplace with a pile of wood stacked beside it. There was a tiny kitchen, a single bedroom, and a bathroom with a sink that coughed brown water before running clear. The walls were thin. I could hear every creak, every shift in the wood. I told myself it was normal for an old place like this. The first night, I barely slept. The forest was loud in a way I wasn't used to. The wind howled through the trees, branches scratched against the roof, and every so often, I swore I heard something moving outside. Probably just animals, I told myself. Still, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle just in case. That helped, but not much. The second day, I explored the area a bit, walking through the trees with a hunting knife strapped to my belt. I didn't go far. The trees were too thick, and after a while, I realized I wasn't even sure I'd be able to find my way back without following my own footprints. That was enough exploring for me. I went back to the cabin and spent the rest of the day reading an old book I had brought, the kind with yellowed pages and a cracked spine. It was the only thing that kept me from focusing too much on the noises outside. The second night, something changed. I woke up in the dark, my skin cold with sweat. It wasn't a sound that woke me up. It was a feeling, something deep in my gut telling me I wasn't alone. I lay still, breathing slow, listening. The wind had died down. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the porch outside. I held my breath. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Someone was out there. The footsteps stopped at the door. I could hear them shifting slightly, the wooden planks creaking under their weight. I reached for the knife beside my bed, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. The door didn't open. The lock held. The chair was still wedged against the handle, but the presence outside didn't leave. I lay there for what felt like hours, my muscles tight, my eyes locked on the faint outline of the door. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, sunlight was slipping through the grimy window. The chair was still against the door. The lock was still in place. But when I stepped onto the porch, I saw them. Footprints. Clear, deep impressions in the mud. Bare feet. I packed my things. I wasn't going to stay another night. As I stuffed my bag, I heard something outside. A rustling, the crunch of leaves. I turned to the window, expecting to see an animal. A deer, maybe. Instead, I saw movement between the trees. A figure, tall, standing still, watching. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see details, just the shape of a person, half hidden in the shadows. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and ran for my car. The mud was slick, my boots slipping as I reached the driver's side. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the lock. I glanced back at the trees. The figure was gone. The car engine roared to life, and I tore down the dirt road, branches scraping the sides as I went. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement, until the trees weren't so thick, until the cabin was far behind me. I never looked back.